May 3, 2016 ATB, Shinjuku Ghetto, Tokyo Settlement. 2023, and according to Miss Fujiko, the Terminal Number 3 office will be completely empty, as the fumigation process isn't expected to wrap up until next Monday afternoon, Tanya said, pausing to turn to the next page in her notebook. Which means that we have almost a week-long window to take action. After that, the weekly password will cycle, and infiltrating the Harbor Master's office will have to be postponed, and of course, a delay in acquiring the information Kyoto requested would be unfortunate, yes, as it would probably reduce the value. Naoto sighed, eyes half closed as he tried to remember where exactly Tokai was concerning Shinjuku. Somewhere to the south. East, I think? I suppose that's all doable. It's a bit of a trip from Shinjuku, though, way too far to walk, at least without the day pass lapsing. So, that leaves either stealing a car or taking the train, right? That's right, Tanya confirmed, and of the two, I think the train is the best option. Stealing a car introduces an unnecessary level of risk into the operation, as well as an uncontrolled factor. After all, what if the car's owner happens to notice 4 or 5 numbers driving off in his sedan? Police attention for any reason is undesirable, especially since information known to be compromised loses a good deal of its value. Which would give Kyoto House an excuse to haggle us down. All right, train it is, Naoto nodded along, fully aware that the younger half-breed had likely already come to that decision and was probably just humoring him by explaining her reasoning. That's going to require work passes, though. Plus some Britannian currency for the fare, not to mention getting the exterminator get-ups together. Already handled, Tanya's cool voice came on the heels of his own. I spoke with Ino before I headed over here. Work passes, train fare, bribe money, and a few extra pounds will be waiting at the station by the Kawadacho checkpoint, along with packs containing the jumpsuits, gas masks, and goggles, not to mention dummy canisters and aerosol dispensers. All we'll need to do is fill out our names on the passes and stroll on through. Naoto nodded along, again more as a formality than anything else. The so-called station was, in truth, just a reinforced basement similar to the old Kozuki cell headquarters, one of the many Tanya had commanded to be established throughout Shinjuku. The pocket strongholds were each garrisoned by a 5-man squad at all times, with fresh units rotating every 8 hours or so. Naoto didn't know how effective they'd be if push came to shove, but... His brow creased. Naoto replayed the last few lines of the planning session back through his mind. Something was bothering him, something Tanya had said. Now, the diminutive resistance leader was saying, I'm going to need every man chosen to have at least a decent grasp of Brie. Wait a second, Naoto interrupted, palms pressed against the table as he halfway rose out of his chair. Stop. Back up a step. What was the last thing you said? All of the necessary materials will be waiting by the Kawadacho checkpoint, Tanya replied, head tilted inquisitively. Ino told me she'd take care of it. All we'd need to do is write our names down on the work passes. Right, that's what I was afraid of. Naoto relaxed back into his seat and gave the girl a smile he didn't feel. That is what Hajime Tanya was, after all, a girl, a child. It was easy to forget that she was only slightly older now than Callan had been when their father came for them. For all of her maturity, she still thought like a child in some surprising ways. Tell me, Tanya, he continued, speaking carefully and calmly, trying to sound as reasonable as possible without being patronizing. Why did you use the term we regarding this strike team? A pair of big blue eyes blinked questioningly at him from across the table. Because I would be leading the unit, of course, Tanya replied matter-of-factly as if that was a given. I am probably the most experienced small unit leader we have present in Shinjuku, with Ogi currently in Gunma. After all, I have led multiple small unit actions in just the last month. I can also speak Britannian without an 11 accent. You are mostly correct, Naoto said, before explaining. You are absolutely correct about your qualifications, even if I suspect that you're underselling yourself. However, you will not be leading the unit tomorrow. In fact, Tanya, you should consider yourself removed from the list of personnel available for this kind of mission. He paused. Besides, aren't you a bit short to be an exterminator? I'm sorry, but I don't understand what you're saying, Naoto. Tanya's tone was as cool and conversational as ever, but Naoto had grown wise to her game over the months. He heard the note of uncertainty under the smooth armor of the persona she had cultivated. Even if he'd missed that clear tell, the way her eyes had widened ever so slightly at his pronouncement would have served as an announcement of her sudden confusion. So immature in strange ways, Naoto thought fondly. It almost feels like I caught her sneaking cookies or something. Didn't she raid Ogi's snack stash that one time? I wonder if she ever realized that he'd bought those chocolate cookies specifically for her. Tanya, Naoto began again, I know that you believe that leading the rising sun is your duty. Yes, he waved down the incipient interruption he knew was coming. Yes, I know that you recognize my paramount leadership and so on. Just, please listen, all right? After a moment, the blonde slowly nodded, and Naoto continued. Now, I know you feel like the rising sun is your duty. I don't know if I agree with that, but I will say you do a wonderful job at it. The people, in case you didn't know, love you. Personally, I think you have the blessing of the gods, and that you are the leader we need. But, that doesn't mean you need to lead everything. And again, he waved placatingly at the brewing objection he could already hear. I know that you delegate quite often. I am aware of your attempts to identify and raise more leaders to handle your duties. That's not what I'm talking about. Maybe I'm doing a bad job at explaining myself, but, to be completely blunt, Tanya, you've become important. Too important. You are now too important to risk as the leader of a small unit. He paused long enough to shoot her a dry smirk. Congratulations, Tanya, you've become a general. Naoto barely had time to lean back into his chair with his piece said before Tanya was jumping to rebuke it. I am not that important. She immediately replied, words heated and passionate for all that she tried to hold on to her typical mask of chilly dispassion. I am skilled, yes, and I am intelligent, but I am nothing special. You can give better speeches. Ogi is a better teacher. Callan will soon be the better fighter if she isn't already. Ino is a far better logistician than I'll ever hope to be. I am good, but I'm not irreplaceable. This might just be the most genuine emotion I've seen out of her in quite a while. Naoto raised an eyebrow. Did I manage to touch a nerve somehow? I spent 4 months training 20 men and I got 2 of them killed. My greatest accomplishment was touching off a mass slaughter that has in turn spiraled out into a cycle of all-consuming violence. With every word Tanya's volume and temper ratcheted higher and higher, dragging Naoto's worry over her mental state along with them. And while I was busy leading good people to their deaths, you built a civic government and began a massive urban renewal project. And, of course, I didn't stop there. I managed to negotiate not 1 but 3 disastrous bargains with Kyoto House, Tanya continued, the first of which swapped handling dirty work for the 6 houses for an abandoned high school and the second of which involved indebting myself to a sociopath in exchange for basic supplies. The third deal handed the 6 houses a profit conservatively measured in the hundreds of thousands of pounds, if not the millions. I wonder how long she's been sitting on all of this, Naoto wondered, frown deepening with every word from her lips. Since Christmas, it sounds like. And then I spent weeks of my free time trying to figure out how to put my magic to use, and for all of that I got a half-assed joke I've only been able to use once. The rant washed over Naoto as Tanya decided to take advantage of his invitation and the privacy to vent and get some things off her chest. So no, Naoto, Tanya said, her voice flattening back out, her pent-up emotions seemingly spent, I am not irreplaceable. My magic is a non-factor. We have people capable of doing anything else I can do, and any public support I have is based on our organization's material assets, not a particular regard for me personally. Were I to die tomorrow, the struggle would continue. For a moment, both sat in uncomfortable silence. In the wake of her rant, Tanya seemed almost smaller somehow, almost lighter, as if she had been drained and exhausted by unburdening herself of her troubles. Naoto, on the other hand, was frantically scrambling for something to say in response to the matter-of-fact fatalism hanging in the air. How do I inspire the girl who's inspired me to reach heights I'd never dare to dream of? Perhaps, Naoto finally replied. But I'd miss you. So would Callan. I know Ogi would miss you too, as would Ino, Nagata, Tamaki. Probably not Chihiro, but I doubt you'd miss her if she caught a bullet tomorrow either. So that's fair all the way around. Naoto's small gallows side joke was rewarded by an almost invisible smile, the corners of Tanya's mouth quirking up in cynical amusement for just a moment before she straightened her face back out again. That doesn't make me special, though, she stubbornly rebutted. Most people have someone who would miss them if they die. I'm not special in that regard, nor irreplaceable. Everybody's lost something, yet the struggle will go on. Naoto rubbed at his eyes. It's like dealing with Callan, he thought with exasperation, but even worse. She's way too damned cynical for her age, and she still hasn't figured out how to stop suppressing her emotions, at least when Ogi's not around. Look, Tanya, he tried again, you're just wrong. I'm sorry, but that's just how it is. You've made yourself the face and the spirit of this fight. The fact is, for us rebels here, for the rising sun, you're more than a person, Tanya, you're a symbol now. You have to realize that, right? Predictably, Tanya fervently shook her head in denial. I don't know whether to be depressed or annoyed, Naoto sighed. How about I settle for sarcastically amused? Oh, Tanya, Naoto groaned as he rubbed his tired eyes. You're fucking killing me here, kid. All right, let me spell it out for you. He didn't need to look to know there was a frown on her adorably pinched face. You know why you're their symbol, Tanya? Naoto started rhetorically, leaning in across the table for emphasis. It's because you're a Shinjuku street rat, just like them. You've clawed your way to survive in this hell for years, just like them, all until you had enough power to do something. Most people? Naoto let out a bitter laugh. The moment they have an inch of power they use it to abuse everyone beneath them, always desperate for more. Selfish survival at all costs, even if it means you have to drag everyone else down to do it. But you, on the other hand? Naoto shook his head with a proud grin. When you found us, you didn't want us to just be another petty gang of power-hungry thugs. You inspired us to fight back against not just the Britannians, but against the gangs, the small evils that the JLF and Kyoto House tolerated and in fact made use of. As soon as you got money and supplies, you started distributing them to the community, sharing the wealth instead of hoarding it. Face it, Tanya, Naoto grinned at the girl, amused by how wobbly her stoic mask suddenly looked. You are the prodigal daughter who's made it good and brought back food, medicine, and hope to the scrapings of the ghetto. To them? I'm still an outsider. I still smack of Britannia and of nobility. I wasn't there. But you? You were. You were there with them. You haven't forgotten them. And they love you for it. Let's agree to disagree, Tanya proposed, her voice just slightly thicker than normal, hardly noticeable unless the listener was familiar with her usual metronome precision. Nope, Naoto cut her off, crossing his arms firmly over his chest. Sorry Tanya, but if you're gonna be this stubborn I'm just going to have to pound this through your thick skull, Naoto thought, bracing himself for still more unpleasant conversation in an evening already full of the stuff. He could already see the shock at his interruption transmuting to outrage in Tanya's eyes. It's just like dealing with Callan. Well, I guess it's time to put on my big brother pants again, eh? But, Tanya started. Nope. Naoto shut her down again. He leaned down, making sure to meet her sapphire gaze, and spoke slowly and clearly, doing everything he could to broadcast his sincere intent. You are irreplaceable, Tanya. That is a fact. The people love you, everyone in the organization loves you, I love you. And we wouldn't be anywhere near where we are today without your drive. I'm not. Tanya protested futilely, the cracks in her mask growing. I'm just the person who's inspired us to go farther than we ever dared dream? Naoto smirked. The girl who's led all of the most successful raids in our history? The kid who managed to take the fight straight to Britannia, and brought 8 of her soldiers back alive? The only person I've heard of to pit infantry against nightmares and win since Todo left at Tsukushima? She folded under the weight of her accomplishments, so Naoto ruthlessly pushed his advantage further. How about the girl who managed to negotiate with both the 6 houses and the JLF, people who were so far out of our league not even a year ago that I would have never even considered making contact? Naoto leaned forward again, letting his voice soften. I can't even begin to count the number of people who are alive today because of you, and you're only 12. How many more lives will you impact as you grow older? How many more people will you inspire? Naoto sat back up, shaking his head with a soft chuckle. The fact is, Tanya, you're the heart of this operation. Without you, we might all fall apart. Then why are you trying to demote me? Tanya asked angrily, lashing out in response to his emotional appeal. Why are you taking me away from the front, Naoto? Surely I am the best combat leader we have. Why aren't you using me to my full potential? When we divided up responsibilities, you said I'd be in charge of combat operations. Have you changed your mind? Did I lose your confidence along the way? What? Naoto blinked, nonplussed. No, don't be silly. Why would you even think that? Actually, no, don't bother. No, Tanya, you haven't lost my confidence or whatever. You're just too important. If anything, you're getting a promotion. I mean... He stopped himself and sighed. Look, it's like chess. Do you know chess? When Tanya tentatively nodded, Naoto continued. It's like chess. The king can't lead from the front, because if the king gets captured, that's it, game over. The king has to stay in the back and direct the movement of the other pieces. If a pawn or a bishop gets it, that's a loss. If the king gets it, well, that's that, game over. And so I can't lead from the front. I've got to stay in the rear. A complicated expression crossed Tanya's face, and even after months of experience with the enigmatic girl with ancient eyes, Naoto couldn't begin to unravel what it meant. A cushy position in the rear. Because I'm too valuable to risk in combat. Suddenly, she was glaring at him. Is this some kind of joke? She hissed, are you trying to protect me like you did with Callan? Nope, Naoto easily replied. I learned my lesson. Strange as this might be to say, considering that you are technically still too young to take your high school admissions exams, but your ability as a planner, a propagandist, and a living symbol now outweigh your admittedly impressive skills as a soldier, junior officer, and assassin. Frustratingly, she still looked somewhat unconvinced. Gods, what do I need to say to her? Naoto half thought, half prayed. How do you convince someone who goes to war like she's meeting her beloved that she can do far more damage from behind a desk? Suddenly, inspiration struck. I'm not trying to protect you, Tanya, Naoto continued. I'm trying to take maximum advantage of a scarce resource, namely, your mental capabilities. There are over 200,000 people in Shinjuku. Good killers and squad leaders are ultimately replaceable. Those who aren't replaceable are people like you. People who can command power with the wisdom and compassion needed to actually save our people. Wisdom and compassion? Tanya's scorn was obviously played up, a cheap emotional display to conceal the more sincere emotions Naoto could practically feel radiating off her from across the table. Well, you are the leader and the Kozuki of the Kozuki organization. If you're really sure about this. I am, Naoto said firmly. If I am your leader, I will put you where I think you will do the most good for the cause. In this case, I firmly believe your mind is more valuable than your trigger finger. Well, in that case. Tanya rubbed briefly at her eyes before lifting her notebook to her face and flipping through some pages. Hang on, I have a list of promising squad leaders from amongst the Sun Guards somewhere. For the remainder of the meeting, Naoto stayed on edge, waiting for the seemingly inevitable moment when Tanya would just happen to task herself with some sort of role in tomorrow's mission, or in one of the multitudes of other, smaller tasks that involved significant personal risk. The moment never came, and the remainder of the meeting was quite productive. As he got ready for bed and slipped between the sheets of his cot, all Naoto could think about was how, strangely, he had finally made good on the request Ogi had made during that drinking session up on the roof of this very building almost a year ago now. He had finally found a role for Tanya in the organization that kept her far from the front line. Somehow, he thought as he drifted off to sleep, I doubt this is quite what Ogi had in mind. May 4, 2016 ATB, Ashford Academy, Tokyo Settlement. 1400. Attention all students. Millie's voice came in, chipper and bright over the intercom as she interrupted sixth period. Please report to the gymnasium for a mandatory assembly. Teachers, please make sure your students arrive at the gym in the next 15 minutes. See you there. At the front of the classroom, Mrs. Selwyn, the literature teacher, sighed as she dropped her chalk and wiped the dust off her fingers. I suppose John Donne can wait for another day since I doubt this assembly will be over by the time the bell rings. He has waited 4 centuries, so it shouldn't be that much of an imposition. Callan forced herself to return the teacher's smile as she hastily packed her materials away and buried the familiar anger. Of course I couldn't enjoy one of the few things I like about this school in peace. No, of fucking course not. Millie just has to shove her arrogant head into things. Mrs. Selwyn, at only 33 years old, was one of Ashford's younger teachers, and definitely one of the most popular. That was most likely due to her lax approach to homework, as well as the way she filled out her dress. Callan had heard more than enough whispers swapped between the boys and the girls sitting around her regarding that particular topic, enough to make her gag. I wonder if their disgusting depravity comes from being Britannians, nobles, or teenagers? Callan grumbled internally. She very carefully didn't think about the fact that she was all three of those as well. Still, what Callan appreciated about Mrs. Selwyn was her actual skill as a teacher, not as a source of easy A's or eye candy. Unlike many of Ashford's other teachers, Mrs. Selwyn brought a genuine enthusiasm for her topic into the room. Her class never felt like she was just checking boxes off a list of mandatory topics while filling her students' heads with Britannian indoctrination. It felt like she took them on a real journey through history and culture every period. Though even for a literature teacher there were subjects and interpretations even Mrs. Selwyn avoided. She was enthusiastic about teaching, not suicidal. In the endless swamp of irritations great and small best known as Ashford Academy, Mrs. Selwyn's class was an enriching experience for Callan, something that always made her soul sing with relief. And that's a hell of a lot more than I can say about anything else in this gaudy shithole, Callan thought as she sucked in a harsh breath, trying to force her anger back under control. And of course, Millie had to ruin it for her own amusement just like always. Can't wait to see what absurd farce she has waiting for us this time. Callan sighed and flipped her academy-issued valise closed. She joined the queue at the classroom's door, wincing slightly whenever another student jostled her. Tanya had been particularly aggressive during yesterday's training session, not that Callan minded. Far from it. Callan grinned to herself. I pinned her 3 out of 5 times last night. Her damned midget arms can't hold me down anymore. The grin faded. Now if only I could beat her on the range, she'd have to send me to the school. The tiny tributary of teenagers fleeing from the works of John Donne fed into the slowly swelling river of the student body as more students poured out of classrooms and laboratories. Most took the opportunity presented by the sudden break from routine to chat with their friends as they made their way down to the academy's massive gymnasium. How many could I kill if I planted just a single bomb here, in this hall? Callan wondered idly as she picked her way through the crowd. I wonder how many of these pampered nobles would survive to get the wake-up call they so richly deserve? Callan let the pleasant image of the aftermath, drawn from her memories of the subway station, linger. It was a temporary refuge from reality. The thoughts of stuffy Britannians screaming and crying as the real world crashed down on them in all of its horrors lifted her mood from her thoughts of Millie's frivolous interference. But, after a moment, Callan regretfully let the fantasy drift away. After all, I don't need Tanya giving me another lecture. She shivered at the thought. Her friend had made it abundantly clear to Callan how unhelpful such an act would ultimately be, the one time she'd proposed it, but it's still fun to think about. Hey. Just the thought of Millie's horrified face as her whole palace burns around her. This time, the smile that slipped onto Callan's face was entirely genuine. Keeping that thought in mind, Callan kept the smile on her face as she rejoined the chattering flow. She was a professional, as she had so often told herself, and so she played her part as the well-adjusted and socially engaged young lady to the hilt as she made her way to the gymnasium. She nodded happily to anybody who made eye contact, fueling her smile with secret thoughts of murder. I wonder how many of the smiles surrounding me are equally deceptive. It was a troubling thought. I mean, I'm betting none of these idiots have any idea who I really am or what I do at night, but that can cut both ways. How many of these smiling students are secretly police informers, eager to pass my name on to their handlers? I can't stand out. I can't slip up. I can't trust any of them, not one bit. Suddenly inspired by the paranoia-inducing thought, Callan allowed herself to be dragged into a conversation with Stephen and Kara, from the student newspaper. The nattering and shallow exchange was a waste of time in her opinion, even if it did make for effective social camouflage, and she happily moved on even before Kara started glowering at her. Kara tended to be protective of her boyfriend, and Callan might have even called her clingy if it wasn't for Steve's wandering eyes, or hands. As it was, she could only hope that he was found out in a suitably public fashion to maximize both of their embarrassment. Is there a more revolting cesspool of disgusting masks and depraved intent than this excuse for a school? Maybe it's on purpose, to give kids practice at the circus called noble politics? Callan almost sneered. And don't think I didn't notice you two coming out of the ladies' room together, Callan thought, adding the tiny detail to her internal notes as she swapped speculations about the surprise assembly with Kara. I wonder if Ashford has a maternity uniform ready to be issued. Considering who designed this absurd uniform, I wouldn't be surprised. As she left her slow-moving club members behind, the pair seemingly more focused on each other than on the assembly they were supposed to be heading towards, Callan noticed another quiet figure skulking along the wall. That's the nerd from my chemistry class, right? Callan frowned, trying to remember the name. Something European, right? Einstein? Eisenstein? No. Einstein. Nina Einstein. That's right. She's on the student council with rivals and Millie, and judging by how the teacher talks to her, something of a science prodigy. For a moment, Callan weighed her options. On the one hand, she'd love nothing more than to ignore the girl whose unsubtle gaze had lingered on Callan uncomfortably often over the last few months. On the other hand, she had to at least appear to be a sociable young Britannian lady, and speaking with the quiet nerd with eyes for her would probably be less infuriating than dealing with any of her louder peers. Plus, if she really is that much of a science prodigy, perhaps I'll find some use for her. Hey there, Nina. Callan chirped in her best Millie Ashford-inspired voice. The immediate wave of self-loathing she experienced probably meant she had struck the proper balance of vapidity and smug self-satisfaction. God, I hate this place. Still, Callan forced her revulsion down and focused on the task at hand with all the false cheer she could manufacture. Looking forward to the assembly. Oh. Hi, Callan. The bespectacled girl's greeting was almost drowned out by the ambient clatter of the hallway. Callan resisted the urge to demand that she speak up. How are you? Let's see, I've interacted with Nina a grand total of once before, and that was when I just asked if we'd had homework for chem the night before. So, no information about her likes or dislikes. Other than that wandering eye of hers. Damn. Sincerity it is, I guess. Curious to hear what interrupted literature class, Callan replied with a grimace. I stayed up late to finish last night's homework, and Selwyn didn't even collect the assignments before the announcement came in. I could have gotten a whole hour of sleep and pushed the essay on iambic pentameter off for a whole nother day. You shouldn't wait on your homework, Nina retorted, flashing slightly under Callan's incredulous gaze. Well, it would only get worse. And this way, you won't have to do it tonight, right? Well, you might have a point there, Callan grudgingly admitted. I guess that will give me time to catch back up on chemistry, freakin' Millerity. Do you want any help? Nina timidly asked, clearly forcing herself to look at Callan as she spoke. I'd probably be able to help explain stuff to you. Real subtle, Nina. Callan nearly sighed aloud with her irritation. It's totally not like you've been struggling to not stare at my tits the whole time we've been talking, right? Still, I could probably use a few pointers, and it wouldn't be too much trouble to break her if she got too handsy. And, unlike Millie, she doesn't have any special social status to protect her. I might take you up on that offer some other day, Callan said aloud, but I've got plans already. I really would appreciate some help, though. You seem to truly have a knack for all this science stuff. Thanks. Nina blushed. I genuinely like it. Hard numbers, hard facts. It's way easier to understand than people are. Aren't you on the student council? Callan asked as they approached the gym's entrance, feigning ignorance. I think I remember Ivel's mentioning you at some meeting. I'm the treasurer, Nina mumbled. I'm good with math too. Math and science. And computers. That's all I'm really good for. Hey now, no need to be down on yourself, Callan replied, suddenly uncomfortable. Damn it, Tanya's the reassuring one. I'm the one who asks the hard questions. Well, me and Nato. And Dathard. Maybe I need to branch out? There's nothing wrong with liking computers. Heck, I wish I liked math too. That would make things so much easier. Thanks, Callan. Nina replied with a shy smile. Hey. Are you busy after the assembly? Depends on how long it goes. If Millie doesn't take too long, we've still got 7th and 8th periods, Callan pointed out. And yeah, I have plans after school today, remember? Sorry, Nina. Maybe some other day? Why yeah, Nina sighed, not before shooting Callan what the Stadtfeldherres could only describe as a glance pregnant with longing. Someday. Bye, Callan. Bye, Nina, Callan replied awkwardly as the shorter girl disappeared into the milling crowd of students. See you around. What a creep, Callan thought with a shiver of disgust as she waited for the crush of students around the gym's entrance to dissolve. A pair of teachers were bellowing something about standing in alphabetical order by last name, so Callan moved towards the back of the crowd, reasoning that the S's would probably be at the back of the assembly anyway. Well, maybe not a creep. Just an awkward and weird girl. But, man, even rivals isn't that obvious. Learn some control, Nina. Then Callan remembered who she attended school with. Not just the Britannian noble children, with their arrogance and games and careless hedonism, who made up the student body, but the self-proclaimed Queen of Ashford Academy and sitting president of the Student Council. Admittedly, all things considered, it's a miracle you're as reasonable as you are, Nina. After all, you could be another Millie. Then, as if even thinking the name had somehow summoned her presence, a miniaturized yet energetic pocket catastrophe fell on Callan's shoulders. Hey ya Callan, a smirking Millie Ashford said by way of greeting, slipping out from the crowd and into Callan's personal space. Long time no see. It's almost like you've been avoiding me. Not at all, Madam President, Callan replied to the blonde, suppressing her age at the other girl's faux pas in favor of a sweetness just a hint too saccharine to be sincere. I've just been very busy lately, you know how it is. Finals are less than a month away, so I've been pretty busy reviewing. If pressed, Callan would be forced to admit that she no longer hated Millie the same way she had last year, before their little détente in January when Millie had let her mask of aloof whimsy momentarily slip. The revelation that the teasing blonde actually gave a shit about rivals and even seemed to sincerely care about Callan had been eye-opening. No longer did Millie seem like some sort of cold-hearted spider, constantly attempting to enmesh her in her shadowy web. That slight improvement in her opinion of the other girl hadn't diluted the rest of Callan's resentment, however. Whether or not she had a heart didn't change the fact that Millie swanned about the place as if it was her personal palace, tweaking and teasing everyone around her in elaborate manipulations for no purpose but her own sense of whimsy and perverse pleasure. Oh yes, I still hate that frivolous bitch. I'd hack that oh so carefully shampooed hair from her scalp with a dull knife if I could get away with it. Callan scowled internally. But, I can't say she's completely worthless as a human being. She's just a juvenile, nosy, arrogant, horny brat of a Britannian lady who's in dire need of a reality check outside the walls of her little empire, where she holds all the cards. An image flitted through her brain, of taking Millie down to Shinjuku to see that pile of butchered meat they turned those other Britannian pubs into. Of showing the Ashford heiress her brother's special basement, where they'd ground the remains of other arrogant Britannians down into so much ash and slurry. Of introducing her to Tanya. Callan knew it would never happen, but the daydream tasted as sweet as sin. Boring. Millie rolled her eyes dramatically, her expression suddenly drooping with feigned weariness. You're going to grow old and grey before your time if you keep it up, and then how will you get a boyfriend? Live a little, Callan. Live a little? Callan almost sneered. Do you call indulging in classroom debauchery living? I live plenty already, thank you very much, Callan replied coolly. I've got my classes, all of my holidays are booked solid with all the stupid social events my mother keeps forcing me to attend, and I've got my extracurricular. I'm busy enough, and that's not even getting into my study time. Your extracurricular? The damnable smirk returned to Millie's face, the exhausted mask vanished without a trace. Which one? Do you mean the Ashford Gazette? Or do you mean the charity you're running out in the settlement? From what I hear, you put on quite the performance there on Monday. I guess there's hope for you after all, Staffelt. I knew you had to have some of that deliciously hot red-headed passion somewhere deep inside. Fuck. In that instant, Callan had to resist the urge to whirl around and pin Millie by her throat until her poisoned tongue protruded, bloated and swollen, from between her lips. Remember why you're here, Kozuki. I don't know what you're talking about, Callan replied, trying to stall. There isn't much about Monday that I'd call passionate. The soup was kind of spicy, I guess. What does she know? Callan scrambled through the memories of the night in her head. Whatever she knows, she got it from rivals. That boy is obsessed with her and would tell her anything she wanted to hear. So, she knows about the encounter with the soldiers, but not my talk with Alan. Why does she care about any of that? Millie waggled a reproving finger under Callan's nose. Callan resisted the temptation to bite it off. None of that sass. I know exactly what you did, even second-hand. Callan, you might as well have handed that poor man a sword and told him to go slit open his belly. I mean, it probably would have been kinder than eviscerating him with words like you did. Millie smiled. I'm proud of you, Stadtfeld. You're growing into a splendid young Britannian flower. A splendid Britannian flower? Callan's teeth ground together so hard her gums ached, and it took all she had not to slug the bitch in the face. Fuck you. The tinkling of bells filled the air and Millie's eyes flew open. Her hand darted into her pocket, and as Callan very carefully didn't react to the sudden movement, she pulled out her phone and turned off an alarm. Looks like I gotta go. Sorry Callan, I'd love to chat, but today's a special day and I'm a little busy. Things to see, people to do, you know how it is. Sure, whatever, Callan said, still trying to push down her boiling fury. Don't let me keep you, Madam President. Make sure you don't slip out of the assembly early, Callan, Millie said, turning on her heel and starting to dart away into the crowd. It's in the memory of our dear departed royals, after all. Plus, there's a surprise at the end, and I'm betting you're gonna love it, Tilda. Callan's eyes narrowed. A surprise? She started through gritted teeth, but Millie was already gone, lost in a sea of uniforms. Fuck. What does that bitch have planned next? Callan forced her jaw to unclench with an angry breath. Damn it, I can't let this get to me. Deep breaths, Callan. Focus on the mission. Minutes later, Callan finally found her way into the gymnasium and to her allotted spot in the neatly ordered lines. Finally, after much shuffling around, the assembly began with the opening bars of the Academy's anthem blaring through the public address system. Then Millie took the stage, leaping up onto the platform where commentators and referees sat during volleyball games, and where a podium with a microphone dutifully awaited her arrival. Good afternoon to all the handsome boys and pretty girls out there. And also to the rest of the Ashford student body. How are you doing this fine spring day? The blonde basked in the dutiful applause and the adoring cries of Millie, be my girlfriend, from the audience. Callan resisted the urge to scowl at the theatrics. Glad to see you're all awake out there. Now, while I'm sure you all would love nothing more than to watch me rock the stage for the next half hour or so. Millie paused invitingly, and a chorus of wolf whistles obliging rose from the crowd. I'm going to hand you all over to Major Pitt, of His Majesty's Armed Forces Reserve Officer Training Corps. I do so love a dashing man in uniform, so please be kind to him. The man Millie handed the microphone over to was, in Callan's opinion, far from dashing. A finely pointed waxed moustache 30 years out of style failed to liven up the face of a born bureaucrat, and while his uniform was well tailored and fit him well, it still failed to be particularly flattering. But none of that changed the fact that he was still Britannian military, a threat and an enemy to any who opposed his cruel empire. I have a bad feeling about this. Good afternoon, my lords and ladies, Major Pitt began, his tone almost depressingly mundane after Millie's enthusiasm. Thank you all for attending this assembly, and thank you to Ashford Academy for giving me some time to speak with you. At some invisible signal, a light wave of applause washed through the gymnasium. Callan reluctantly joined in, clapping presumably at the mention of the Academy's name. At least the bastard in grey shut up for a moment, so I guess that's something. After a moment, Major Pitt waved for quiet and continued as the desultory applause faded away. I'm sure that you are all aware that our beloved Vice-Regal Governor, Prince Clovis, has declared May the 4th as Vi Britannia Day, a holiday dedicated to his much-lamented royal siblings. What the hell? Callan frowned, slightly confused. What was with that pause just now? And it's a bit hard to tell from all the way back here, but did Pitt just sneer at the mention of the dead kids? That's weird. I have a prepared statement to read on His Highness's behalf, Pitt said as he opened an envelope on stage, no trace of his peculiar expression remaining as he unfolded the contents. Indeed, all of you fine young lords and ladies should be honored. This speech came straight to my hands from His Highness's desk itself, written expressly for you on this very first Vi Britannia Day. To all of my dear subjects, the Major began, making no attempt to add any rhetorical flair as he read the speech straight from the page. He apparently hadn't been chosen for his assignment on the basis of charisma or showmanship. and in particular to all of the sweet students of Ashford Academy, I bid you greetings. Sadly, I cannot bid you the joyous greetings that the flower of the youth of Britannia deserves, as my heart is burdened with the tragedy of 6 years ago. Indeed, it was 6 years ago that my dear little half-brother, Lelouch vi Britannia, as well as his sister Nunnally, were callously murdered by the Japanese. It was the second great insult that petulant race offered up against our glorious empire, and the one that cuts me deeply to this day. Their first offense was a gauntlet thrown down at the feet of our emperor as the head of state, but the murders were a cowardly attempt to knife the heart of our imperial father. Just a pity we couldn't force a real knife between his ribs somehow, Callan thought, enjoying the mental image as she tried to ignore the slights against her subjugated nation. Up on stage, Pitt continued on, his delivery growing flatter with each passing sentence. If my siblings were alive today, oh Ashford students, they would walk amongst you. Lelouch would be 16 this year, and Nunnally 13. Perhaps they would have been your classmates. And so, I now charge you to go forth to remake the world in their memory. To make a world more beautiful, more artistic, and more Britannian than the cruel world that took them. This I, Clovis La Bretonnia, 3rd Prince of the Britannian Empire, command you. All hail Britannia! All hail Britannia! Even as Callan joined her voice with the crowds in acclaiming the empire she hated, she could only smile with pride at the last actions of the long-dead Prime Minister Kururugi, so different from his degraded son. For all of his foolishness in life, at least the Prime Minister had struck one last blow against Britannia by killing the hostage royals before he further denied Britannia the spectacle of his ritual execution. For all of his failures as a leader, Callan reflected, Kururugi Jinbu died with honor. At least Charles, the man of blood, learned the pain of losing his children thanks to the conquest. Not that he probably cared, the monster. Now? Major Pitt asked, absently returning the envelope containing the prince's speech to his jacket pocket as if it was a mundane document, nothing more important than the utility bill. How many of you are familiar with the ROTC? A forest of hands rose. Callan raised her hand as well so she wouldn't stand out in the crowd. Good to hear, Pitt said with a perfunctory smile. For those unaware, the ROTC is a training cadre for young people from good families, such as yourselves. We provide a first introduction to the basics of military life and strive to educate Britannia's generals, admirals, and commanders of tomorrow, today. For those who show particular aptitude or dedication, the ROTC provides a special track to institutes of higher learning, including the Imperial College at Colchester. Excited murmurs ran through the assembled student body. Callan remained quiet, but she could understand the enthusiasm. The Imperial College was the premier center for higher learning in the empire, and virtually all of the major military, industrial, and technological figures of note in the last century and a half have passed through its halls, including Reuben Ashford, the Academy's headmaster and the father of the modern nightmare frame. The Imperial College at Colchester was also, Callan knew, her own father's alma mater. She had seen the famous seal on a framed diploma hanging in his office at the family's ancestral estate, back in their homeland, at New Leicester. But of course, the ROTC also has a mission to find and recruit promising candidates for roles as junior officers, specialists, or even in admittedly limited cases, nightmare devices. At the mere mention of the prized position, the major had the entire student body hanging onto his every word. Callan was tempted to roll her eyes, but even she couldn't fully deny the flicker of interest deep inside. Yet, neither could she deny her own churning instincts, all of which screamed that she was under threat, that this unassuming man was an enemy of hers in particular. What's your angle here, Major? Come to find more second sons eager to lay down their lives for a taste of pride? Yes, if you have ambitions to one day receive a knighthood and serve in His Majesty's armed forces as a devicer, your best option is to join ROTC, where you will have access to simulators and instructors, Major Pitt said, continuing his sales pitch. Yes, not everybody can become a devicer, only the best. But, if you do manage it, you'll become the armored fist, the bared sword of the Empire. Of course. Callan wanted to sneer. The best of the best. Her lip twitched as she remembered the story Tanya had recounted, of how the so-called bared sword of the Empire met their ignoble end at the hands of a decent ambush conducted by infantry armed with simple rockets. But sure, keep padding their ego. After all, How else are you going to fill your purse with blood money if you can't scrape enough fodder together for the meat grinder? Gotta meet that quota. Why, the Major's waxed mustache flicked upwards in a smile. It was less than a decade ago that those devices, the Empire's later day knights, seized this land from its unworthy inhabitants, conquering this barbaric country in 3 days of victory. When those pathetic numbers caught sight of our glorious knights, they fled from the field in awe and terror. And all their excuse of a leader could do was kill a couple of children out of petty spite. Lies. Callan's soul screeched with indignant fury, ignoring the sour grapes of the Major's last sentence. Lies, lies, lies. Yet for all of her anger, she couldn't immediately refute his claims. The conquest had officially taken a month to complete active operations, but all of the major fighting had taken place during the first 3 days, including the famous miracle at Itsukushima. The mop-up, of course, had continued through to the present. Yeah. We didn't just flee. We're still fighting, you bastard. Why, I remember those days fondly. I was there myself, you know. Cutting down the cowardly 11 army like wheat before the scythe, showing them that their primitive military was no match for a truly honorable foe. The Britannian allowed himself a hearty chuckle. Really, that's all the 11s were good for, left to their own devices, running, hiding, and dying like the worthless dogs. They should thank us for taking them in hand. It was all Callan could do to keep herself from growling aloud. Her hands ached from how tightly she clenched her fists, rage boiling in her veins. Her teeth ground together as she fought for self-control. She could hardly even think, so consumed was she with the effort of reining in her hatred for the mediocre little man who bragged of slaughter. And bragged to children about it. Callan suspected the bland Major Pitt had been far from the cutting edge. Otherwise, his words wouldn't reek quite so strongly of insecurity. A pig like him probably hasn't ever spilled blood. He's just gloating about the sacrifices of better men. Typical of Britannia. That is what the ROTC can offer you, a chance to become a knight, to go abroad seeking monsters to slay. And, Pitt grinned, perhaps rescue a fair prince or princess as your very own reward along the way. A wave of lecherous laughter and whoops, both masculine and feminine, swept through the academy gymnasium, accompanied by a susurration of fervent whispers as seemingly every student present exchanged dreams of glory and conquest. Britannian to the core, all of them. The smile Callan forced onto her lips hurt, but she fed it with dreams of her own glorious war. One day, I'll be the one peeling the skin off your cowardly backs. But, Major Pitt continued after the raucous laughter died down, even if you aren't looking for a career in the military or planning on attempting higher education, ROTC can open many doors for you. The inclusion of ROTC on your resume will tell potential employers that. The sales pitch continued, peppered with smarmy thanks to the Ashford administration for finally allowing ROTC to set up shop on campus, a development that is far overdue, unfortunately, delayed by the circumstances of the area. For her part, Callan did her best to endure the interminably long speech, trying to hold on to her anger as it was slowly drowned in a rising tide of boredom. She idly noted that office space had already been set aside for the on-campus recruiting mission and that part of the equestrian club's riding grounds would be converted into a rifle range. Focusing on the details helped her control her temper. 20 minutes later, Major Pitt finally started winding down his speech. Thank you very much for your close and patient attention. Remember, my door is always open. Now, without further ado, I'll hand you back to the gorgeous Miss Ashford. Thanks, Major. Callan stifled a groan as Millie bounced back onto the stage. And thank you, all you Ashfordians. Let's give the Major a hearty round of applause to thank him for his time. Like a marionette dancing on a string, Callan dully brought her hands together 3 times before abandoning the pretense. How much longer is this damned assembly going to take? She groaned inside her head, shifting her weight from foot to try and channel some of her antsy energy. Even by Britannian standards, it's a waste of everybody's time. And we're paying tuition to be here. You've all been very patient, Millie said from on stage as if she'd heard Callan's unspoken complaint, and my grandfather and I really appreciate it. I'm sure Major Pitt does too. In fact, the Major actually set up a little activity to thank you all and to celebrate Vi Britannia Day. An ominous feeling washed over Callan as uniformed men started wheeling boxy structures that looked suspiciously familiar into the gymnasium, one by one until a full 24 of the things stood between the audience and the stage. So, all you fine strapping young men and fine stripping young ladies, Millie winked, haven't you ever wanted to see what it's like to pilot a nightmare? The crowd roared in agreement, a horde of screaming children crying out for a taste of martial honor without the faintest concept of what it meant to fight for your life. In that roar, Callan thought she heard the true anthem of Britannia, stripped of all of its civilized pretensions. Animals, all of them, she thought with disgust even as she raised her own enthusiastic voice. And they have the nerve to call us barbarians. The teachers once again had to provide crowd control as the student body stampeded towards the line of what Callan had belatedly recognized were KMF simulators. The iron-lunged PE instructor, backed by the assistant headmaster, managed to impose order, chivying eager students into a long queue, which fed into the waiting simulators. Not wanting to stand out in the enthusiastic horde, Callan allowed herself to be herded into line and prepared to wait. The feeling of ominous tension in her gut only increased as the crowd's enthusiasm continued to mount. Something was going to happen very soon, Callan could tell, something big, something awful. Every nerve in her body already felt like it had been scraped with a dull knife. At least the boredom of standing in line was mildly alleviated once one of the techs set up a screen displaying a digital scoreboard. We score your results based on the number of targets destroyed and the length of your time in the simulation, Major Pitt explained as the first students mounted the steps to the simulators. The number of targets destroyed helps us quantify your reaction time and coordination, while the time helps us estimate your endurance. Only a minute later, the first score appeared on the board as a simulator door popped open and a rather chubby boy staggered down the steps. The 3 columns of the screen populated with the boy's initials, the number of targets he had eliminated, 0, and how long he had lasted in the simulation, all of 8 seconds. What kind of test are you running? Callan could clearly hear the petulance over the noise of the crowd. There's no way that's fair. How the hell was I supposed to react to that? I could barely dodge the first strike. Ha! Pitt barked, I said we were here to recruit the best of the best, did I not? Seizing the glory of being a devicer is an honor reserved for only the most elite. The major smirked. We certainly couldn't let any common rabble carry the honor of the Imperial Nightmare Corps, now could we? The boy balked at the man's choice of words and Callan could feel the overall mood of the crowd dim slightly at his public humiliation. The whispers started quietly, but grew rapidly. The sotto voce sentiments were clearly shared by the bulk of the crowd. I don't want to just embarrass myself. Do I really have a chance? It sounds hopeless. Callan almost scoffed, twisting her face into a mask of concern to fit in with the cowards around her. Just one hint of adversity, and you're already willing to call it quits? Typical Britannian nobility, no stomach for real work. No stomach for fake real work, even. Up at the front of the line, just below the stage, Major Pitt frowned heavily at the sudden storm of disconsolate muttering. After a moment, he sneered at the balking line of students and pulled a notepad from his uniform jacket. To Callan's sudden interest, Millie's polite smile stretched into a mockery of itself at the sight of the tiny black book. Immediately, she stepped forward and rested her hand on his shoulders. Not to worry, Major, of course they're a little shy. We so rarely enjoy the company of visiting notables such as yourself, after all. Even my heart flutters at the thought of making a fool of myself in front of you. Millie's eyes darted back and forth over the crowd, undeniably frantic until alighting upon a target, an earnest if vulpine grin suddenly springing across her face. Well, Mr. Vice President, come on up here. Your constituents need encouragement. The packed gymnasium burst into excited tittering and the throng ahead of Callan parted to allow a clear path up to the stage. At the end of the path, previously concealed by the cover of the crowd, a dark figure crossed his arms and glared. Please, Lelouch? Millie begged, and while her smile remained plastered across her face, Callan thought she heard a note of surprising sincerity underneath the light-hearted needling. Come on up here and help us all show the dear Major the depth of our loyalty. With obvious reluctance, Lelouch Lamperouge climbed the steps up the bleachers and joined Millie on the referee platform turned temporary stage. Callan had to admit they made an impressive pair, almost exactly equal in height. Lelouch's raven hair was a perfect contrast to Millie's cornsilk blonde. Like her, he smiled as he stared out over the crowd, but Callan noticed how his hands balled into fists before he nonchalantly tucked them behind his back. Well, there you have it, ladies, Millie shouted, The top scorer will be wined and dined in our darling Lelouch's illustrious company. As the cheers crescendoed, the blonde leered. If you are lucky, maybe you'll even luck your way into a passionate night, only the finest for the heroes and heroines of Britannia. Are people really this shallow? Callan wondered, feeling suddenly very alone in the jubilant atmosphere. She knew the vice president was popular for some inestimable reason, but an obligatory date seemed entirely meaningless to her, barring Millie's mention of a passionate night. There's just no way she'd make him go through with that, would she? There's no way, but... No. Not even Britannians would sell themselves so cheaply. Would they? As for the gentleman... Millie's eyes swept over the room, on the hunt once more. We need a noble lady of refined grace and skill for such a special occasion, which means I unfortunately don't qualify. Her laugh was slightly too shrill. Callan wondered what she was so scared of. Displeasing her Britannian masters, presumably. What do you say, Shirley? Maybe your dear Lulu will rescue you, eh? Your very own knight in shining armor. Madam President. A red-haired girl wailed from up in front of Callan. To Callan's vague disgust, she didn't sound very offended by the suggestion. To her ears, the other girl's objections bore an unmistakably eager edge. Just when I finally thought I'd found another sane person in this asylum. Seriously, is everyone here but rivals and I a complete degenerate? Or? Millie's gaze swept past the redhead and bore into Callan. I have a bad feeling about this, Callan thought as her stomach knotted in sudden anxiety. Damn it, shut up Millie. Just stay quiet. Please just keep your damned trap shut. The favor of a proper lady would be perfect for the gallant winner of our nightmare lay competition, eh? To Callan's horror, Millie's finger lanced out from her perch like a thrown spear, all but dripping with evil energy. Callan, my dear, would you lend me and the Vice President a hand in stoking a fire in the heart of all of Ashford in the Major's honor? From all around Callan lecherous gazes swept over her as her fellow students openly appraised Millie's choice. For her part, Callan bristled defiantly, glaring back at the blonde gorgon. No, she growled silently, I won't be a pawn in your idiotic game. I refuse to contaminate myself with more Britannian filth just to soothe whatever is making you so scared. Fight your own battles, you bitch. The crowd disagreed. Even as she raged internally, Callan felt the invisible pressure mounting all around her. It started out quietly, a soft chant from somewhere off to her left. It quickly rose in volume as the crowd around her took up the cry. Callan tried to drown it out, tried to force her jaw to unclench so she could curse them all into silence, tell Millie to fuck off and be the prize if she was so enamored with the idea. But the swelling chant stifled any protest she might have made. Of course, Millie added from the stage, Lelouch stoically silent next to her, I would make voluntary participation worthwhile. Don't ever let it be said that an Ashford isn't good to their friends. Someone who assists in such a manner deserves a spot on the student council. And the guarantee to be used as a prize at all events to come? To join the president's collection of pet chew toys? Pass. And a day in my family's library would not be amiss. Knowledge is power, after all. Callan. 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 The room shouted eagerly, driven to a fever pitch by the promise of a second prize. Jealous and longing gazes swept over her, pinning her in place. To her horror, Callan couldn't get her mouth to cooperate, couldn't scream out her objections. She was pinned against a wall again, and they were circling around her. Please. No. Not again. No, Callan whispered, her jaw finally coming unstuck, but it was far too little, far too late. The crowd pushed her forward and Callan found herself staggering up the concrete steps of the massive bleachers, up onto the stage. She turned and saw the crowd ranged out in the gymnasium below her, like a multitude mobbing around an altar or a ravenstone, eager to see the chosen victim sacrificed in their ritual. Millie, the high priestess of the rite, grabbed her and Lelouch's hands, lifting them into the air. Callan couldn't muster any resistance, paralyzed by the sea of hungry eyes and gaping mouths spread out before her. If she pushes me off, down into the crowd. The nonsensical thought blazed through Callan's panicked mind, they'll tear me to pieces. They know I don't belong. They know. Whoever manages to earn the top spot in the simulators wins their choice of date between the most eligible boy and girl currently enrolled at the academy, based on my network of informers. Millie turned to her, cornflower blue eyes dancing with sickening mirth over her smile. surprisingly ghoulish at less than a foot away. Either Lelouch Lamperouge, or Callan Stadtfeld, pick your poison. It took everything Callan had, every scrap of self-control and every bit of discipline Tanya had hammered into her to not lash out, to not hook her hands into claws and rip the arrogant smirk off Millie's face, inch by bloody inch. It took even more of her strength to not look at the smiling students who surrounded her and see four equally amorous eyes leering out of long-dead faces. Remember the mission. Anything for the cause, Callan told herself, her internal monologue unconsciously adapting her best friend's mannerisms as it held the rising strain at bay. You're not that same girl, scared and angry, trapped up against a wall. You're not just lashing out. You are a professional on a mission. Control yourself. Remembering Tanya's long ago advice, Callan forced herself to focus on her breathing, ignoring everything else. She'd lasted among all the countless insults and indignancies of her position before. She wouldn't let this farce break her now. I'm stronger than this, Callan thought, pulling her resolve around herself like armor. I'm stronger than her. So resolved, Callan turned her attention away from the queued-up students below her and turned her attention to her fellow victim in Millie's schemes. For his part, Lelouch seemed engrossed in a conversation with the president. Even though they were less than a meter away, Callan couldn't hear their murmuring voices over the crowd's dull roar. Well, at least he isn't looking at me like a piece of meat, Callan noticed. In fact, he doesn't look at all happy, and I can guess why. Some idiot might call him a Prince Lelouch imposter in front of Pitt, and then we'll all have to attend another assembly where they'll wheel him to death for lèse-majesté. Not that he was the only Lelouch attending Ashford. The three boys she knew by that name were discreetly trying to escape out the gymnasium's back door. Callan noticed one of the boys exiting a simulator with an L as his first initial, reflexively cringe away from Major Pitt before steeling himself to shake the officer's hand. Another Lelouch, then. Suddenly, the Lelouch up on the stage with her looked up from his conversation with Millie and caught her eye. It was all she could do to not flinch away from him, just like the boy down below recoiling from Major Pitt. Thankfully, he quickly returned to his conversation with Millie, leaving Callan now irritated with herself as well as with everybody else in the room. It was strange, she thought as he descended from the stage to join the line, how much the enigmatic vice president still disturbed her. Callan had no trouble remembering the unguarded look into his eyes last Christmas, when his mask had slipped, just for a moment. That he was some kind of crazy she had no doubt. What made his brand of crazy so frightening was how good he was at concealing it. Without that look, she'd have been like everyone else, convinced he was a lazy genius wasting his time and talent. But it seemed like Lelouch had evaded everybody else's notice for another day. He descended from his simulator and, after trading a few amiable words and a handshake with Major Pitt, made his escape, disappearing into the crowd of spectators. Callan checked the scoreboard. Lelouch Lamperouge had somehow achieved a perfectly average score, his time and number of kills the exact mean of the student body so far. Oh, look, Millie chirped beside her, finally relinquishing her hand. Callan discreetly tried to wipe the memory of the other girl's hand off on her skirt, but the memory of the pressure remained. Looks like it's your turn now, Callan. This time, the blonde's encouraging smile looked a bit less forced. Callan didn't return it. Make sure you put a good show on for me, okay? Perhaps you can even have a date with Lulu Tilda. By the time she had made her way down the stairs, Callan had worked out her plan. Judging by the scoreboard, her fellow students were lasting just under 5 minutes on average and generally managed to destroy only 1 or 2 targets in the simulation. So, she'd do likewise. As soon as she destroyed her second target, she'd feign exhaustion and bail out, turning in an entirely unremarkable score. I just need to think of this as another infiltration mission, Callan told herself. All I need to do is hold it together, and I'll have a juicy report to hand in to Tanya and Big Bro. And then I can tape a picture of Millie to the punching bag back at the manor and work some of my stress out on it. All right, my lady, said the sergeant manning the small desk in front of the simulators, his rough, lower-class voice rumbling as he copied the information from her ID card into some form on his computer. You're up next. Go ahead and get in number 11. As soon as you sit down and grab the sticks, the simulation will start. Got it, Callan replied, nodding to the soldier before making her way over to the vacant simulator pod. Of course it would be number 11. Callan sneered and forced her apprehension at the bad omen down. Stick with the plan, Kozuki. Keep your hands steady and your mind focused. Just pretend you're Tanya, you'll get through this just fine. Just remember the plan, Callan, she told herself again as the seat began to roll forwards, retracting into the simulator. I don't need to do much, it's not like the top scorer was that impressive. 5 kills is the best Ashford Academy can offer up? Callan scoffed, trying to imagine Tanya's reaction to such a poor showing. So much for noble supremacy. I'll just kill a nightmare or two, run around for a few minutes, let myself die, and then pretend to be disappointed when I step out of the simulator. She nodded to herself, firming her resolve. I probably won't even need to take a dive or whatever, I've never been in a nightmare before. Callan took a deep breath, trying to reassure herself as the box began to close behind her. Her breath came uncomfortably rough, catching in her throat as the lock clicked shut. The din of students faded, overtaken by the electric humming of the machine. Remember what's at stake, Callan. Anything for the cause. Then, Callan was alone in the darkness of the simulator, with only the thought of the cause to sustain her in the box she found herself trapped inside. Her breath hitched as the darkness pulsed, pressing on her unbearably. The large screen in front of her suddenly flickered to life, the darkness fleeing as the seal of the Imperial Britannian Army Nightmare Corps seared into her retinas. As she blinked her suddenly tearing eyes, the loathsome seal disappeared, replaced by a message in dull blue flashing across a light grey background. Loading simulation. Anything for the cause. Almost without thinking, her hand slid into the primary control interfaces as they rose to her from the sides of the pod. Various buttons and levers dotted the rest of the cockpit, their purpose lost on Callan. Blinding light filled her simulator, and her eyes squeezed shut on reflex. A moment later and a view spanning 180 degrees of coverage sprang up before her, banishing the darkness under the harsh glare of its artificial light. She lowered her arms back to the controls, feeling vaguely ridiculous and even more on edge. Looking around with her screens, Callan found herself in a bare-bones urban environment, empty but for her. Looking down, she saw a large rifle waiting, cradled in her four-fingered purple hands. Disturbingly, Callan felt entirely at ease in the simulated nightmare. It should have been a waking nightmare, sitting high above a city's streets in one of the machines that had gutted the Japanese defenses. Instead, Callan found herself marveling at how quickly the simulated frame responded to her motions, one hand flexing up at the mere twitch of her fingers. With every action, every minute movement, the barrier between Callan and the nightmare seemed to fade further away. It was as if she was steadily becoming the Sutherland, and with it, finally being the instrument of Britannian dominion and imperialism her father had always intended her to be, despite all his circumlocutions and claims to the contrary. You should be at ease sitting atop your knightly steed, a corner of Callan's mind said. This was what you were born and bred for. This, just as much as the barony of New Leicester, is your birthright. When you were a child, you could believe in fairy tales, like your Japanese identity. It's time to grow up, to put aside childish things, time to embrace your blood. What a fine young Britannian flower you're becoming. No, Callan growled under her breath as she took her first smooth step in the simulation, willing the treacherous little voice in her head to shut up. Walking in the simulation felt so natural and easy, quieting the voice that sounded so much like her stepmother was all but impossible. No, this isn't me. Callan yelled back in response to the intruding voice worming its way through her mind. I'm not Britannian, not where it counts. Callan Stadtfeld doesn't exist. Only Kozuki Callan is real. She breathed out, forcing her jaw to unclench. That's right. That's right, I'm Kozuki Callan. I'm Japanese. I'm just playing a role right now, she reassured herself. I just need to remember to stick to the plan and it'll all be fine. Adequate movement and coordination confirmed. A cool mechanical voice spoke in time with the words that suddenly flashed in the center of her screen. Callan yelled in surprise, before realizing she'd continued moving forwards in the simulation. Presumably her waffling around had satisfied some program threshold, confirming that she knew the basics of nightmare operation. Skipping introductory tutorial. Advancing to combat scenario number 4. Good luck, Devicer. Callan blinked, and then, crumbling high-rise buildings boxed her in as the setting sun illuminated the narrow alleyway she found herself in. The ground was covered in filth, broken beer bottles, faded bloodstains, just another alleyway in another ghetto. A nightmare rounded the corner ahead of her, an ugly frog-like thing that Callan recognized as a gunru, the standard Chinese model. With a start, Callan realized that it was charging right at her and, up against a wall, a tiny knife is all that stands between her and the four men surrounding her. "I'm no damned Britannian," Callan cries, trying for anger and displaying naked desperation instead. "I'm Japanese. Kozuki Naoto's my big bro, so don't you mess with me." The rifle snapped up, simulated thunder barking a staccato beat as 30mm Gauss rounds lashed out, the gigantic rifle kicking back against her shoulder. The boxy mech, clumsy on its fragile third leg, reeled under the impacts, her shots drilling deep into its cheap, substandard simulated armor and tearing the gunru's central hull apart in a withering barrage. And then it was over. The echoing reports of her gunfire rang out across the empty imitation cityscape. The shredded hulk of her first kill teetered over and crashed to the ground, a surprisingly lifelike simulation of a lifeless hulk. A moment of staring at the smoking nightmare later, Callan's mind finally caught up with her. Fuck, Callan cursed as she tried to get her breathing back under control. Her knuckles were white with pressure as they squeezed down on her gauntlet-like controls, heart hammering in her chest as her adrenaline surged. "Just calm down, and stick to the fucking plan," she said, barely remembering to use Britannian in the likely recorded simulator, even as her mind fumbled for what that plan had been. I just need to." The building in front of her exploded. She ducked, feeling something roar past her overhead, hurling herself behind the skimpy cover of a parked truck as the sound of the bombs thunder up from below her, making the pavement under her feet shake with the impact. The two men at the station's mouth are knocked halfway off their feet and they turn away from her, towards the staircase behind them. From the corner of her eyes she sees Tanya give the signal and suddenly she's running and she surged forward, scrambling from the truck and scanning for a better hiding spot or for her enemies as she tried to get a handle on her surroundings. A distant part of her mind remembered her nightmare's controls, which had seemed so complex yet intuitive at the time. She remembered one option in particular, and her fingers danced across the buttons she needed, effortlessly directing her steed even as she scrambled forwards. Two smoke canisters nestled on the Sutherland's left pauldron popped, shrouding her form in a dense cloud of black smoke formulated to block infrared as well as visual detection. Now hidden from her unseen enemy, Callan took a moment to pop her faceplate open to expose the fact sphere and scan the area with her sensory suite. More shots slammed into the walls of the buildings around her, but with her smoke cloud reducing visibility, none got within 2 meters of her. The radar of the fact sphere cut through the smoke, its report giving her a rough map of her surroundings. As expected, most of those surroundings were static and immobile, the simulated urban jungle and digitized vehicle window dressing reassuringly harmless. The hazy silhouettes staggering through the gloom, on the other hand, were the furthest thing from safe. Even seen through a crude rendering on her instrument panel, they were obviously sweeping the area looking for her, looking for the enemy who had killed their squad mate. She's back in the alley, the figures of the men looming over her. Lecherous grins shine on their faces as they grab her, pulling her knife away and pulling her down to the ground. Callan burst out of the smoke, her rifle up and spitting hate as she strafed hard around their flank, her land spinners kicking up a wave of sparks as she skidded across the cracked pavement. The clunky Chinese mechs were too slow to respond, their scattered fire lagging far behind as her own rounds punched through their paltry armor. She saw one of her shells rip through the central armor of an unlucky frog, eviscerating the machine as it tore a hole between its eyes, right through where the cockpit should have been, where Tanya's bullet is supposed to hit the man but Tanya isn't there and Callan is fighting alone. A shrill scream rips its way from the man's throat as a tiny 3-inch blade finds his kidney, and gritting her teeth Callan rips the blade sideways towards his spinal column, cursing as his lumbar muscles catch the dull blade and Callan threw herself to the side as a burst of 20mm shells slashed overhead, quickly turning her headlong plunge into a mad dash by pivoting on the fingers of one hand, redirecting her momentum towards her assailants. The gunruss, lacking any melee weapons, frantically backpedaled but in the narrow road there was nowhere for them to go as Callan stooped upon them. The man screams as she runs at him, backpedaling frantically as he slashes the air with his knife, trying to keep her at bay. With a burst of speed, she is inside his guard, and with her free hand she first blocks his swing then forces his arm away. Before he can continue his retreat, She punches him in the nose with her knife hand and feels the cartilage crumple under her knuckle. With a burbled scream, the man falls to the ground, and she is upon him. The nearest enemy tried to hold her at bay, both of its built-in machine guns and autocannons attempting to catch up with her speedy approach. The explosive shells lanced overhead and behind her, closer and closer as she neared, but still far too slow to even threaten her. Contemptuously, Callan raised her rifle with one hand, a burst from the nightmare-scaled coil gun silencing one of the Gunru's pauldron-mounted guns as her other hand, her real one, thumbed a switch on her console. Hark unarmed. A solid thump reverberated through the cockpit as a diamond-tipped blade slashed through the air at the end of a wire, burrowing deep into the hapless Gunru's leg. Grinning, Callan charged the trapped nightmare, generations of conqueror ancestors howling for blood in her soul as her fingers clenched tightly inside her gauntlets, bearing down on the sticks that controlled her arms. Steel shrieked as she met the crippled Chinese trash fist first, her iron hand ripping through layers of cheap armor and plunging into the beating heart of the dying frame. The man's open eyes stare up at Callan from his ruined face, the tongue forced out from his crushed throat. They are close enough to be lovers, and Callan can smell the stench of his rotting teeth as she looks into those eyes fixed on eternity and screams, and the remaining pair of Gunrus rushed to aid their disemboweled friend, guns blazing as they desperately tried and failed to force her back. With her handhold on the guts of the other machine, Callan heaved her hostage up from the pavement and threw her land spinners into gear, distantly hearing the sporadic thump of impact against her impromptu shield as she maneuvered backwards. She returned fire from behind the relative safety of her improvised cover, rifle whining as she spat hypervelocity slugs at the last of the pathetic machines that dared to attack her, punching ugly holes in its fragile hide with impunity. Increasing difficulty. But there were more. There were always more. No matter how many of the endless waves of Gunrus Callan killed, more were always somehow waiting just around the corner. Autocannons and machine guns pounded the streets all around her, the simulated city ripped asunder as a never-ending tide of enemies harried her through the burning streets. So she killed and killed and killed until, ammunition zero. Click. Callan's eyes flew wide at the flashing red symbol suddenly flaring to life in the corner of her screen, and she spat a mangled curse as she realized her assault rifle had run dry. The last of her smoke popped from her shoulders, shrouding her in just enough darkness and haze to give her the cover she needed to fling her Sutherland into a hasty retreat down an alley. Callan paused there in the mouth of the alley, taking a moment to gasp for breath and to get her thoughts together, but her head was swimming in so much fear and adrenaline that it was difficult to stay still, even for a second. Her blood thundered in her ears, her heart pounded so hard it felt like it wanted to rip its way out of her chest, and her whole body was drenched in sweat. Fuck, she huffed, chest heaving with harsh breaths. Fuck. I was supposed to. Scrambling through her memories, Callan desperately tried to recall what her objective was, tried to claw together the scraps of the plan she'd started from into something workable, something beyond the next few seconds. But all she could find were twisted reminders of how she'd ended up here, in this alley. The men smile at her and Callan feels her skin crawl. "And I'll take one of your eyes, just for the taste," says the man with the knife as he saunters closer, his comrades pinning her arms behind her shoulders. "But I'll let you keep the other so you can see just what we're gonna do to your pretty little body." "Damn it," she roared, punching the console and suddenly remembering that this was all a simulation, a game. She'd forgotten that she wasn't back in the alley, not really. I should stop, she thought, but it was hard to hear her own voice over her jangling nerves. I was supposed to stop. I can still stop. Blinking the sweat from her eyes, Callan gazed critically down at her rifle and her shield. The gunru was mangled scrap barely held together by ragged mechanical sinew and her rifle was totally spent. She discarded the now useless tools with a sudden spike of disappointed anger, feeling ever more frustrated by her lack of options. She couldn't just fight with her hands. She wasn't done yet. But I was supposed to stop, she reminded herself. I can't remember the plan, but I was supposed to give up, right? Distant gunfire echoed in the ghostly city. All around her, grey and abandoned buildings bloomed to sudden life as explosions shredded them from within, inching nearer to her temporary sanctuary with each passing second. Every breath she wasted in deliberation saw the walls of flame and dust advance ever closer. I've done enough, Callan swallowed, her dry throat working to swallow the syrupy, choking saliva. I should just let myself die, right? Really, that's all the 11s are good for. Left to their own devices, they run, they hide, and they die like the worthless dogs they are. They should thank us for taking them in hand. Callan's teeth clenched down, her jaw aching from the grinding pressure as her hands throttled the plastic sticks, her pride stoked to a boiling, bloody-minded froth. Dogs, were they? She'd show him. She'd show them all. A tenement building next to her exploded, the roof slumping in with palpable exhaustion. Her radar swarmed with signals, all clustered around her. There are at least 10 of them, and Naoto is standing alone between them and 11-year-old Callan. Her brother is always in fights, but this is different. Instead of the lone hoodlum or 2 or 3 hooligans picking a fight with the half-breed or his helpless little sister, a whole gang of them are there, standing in a line across the road. Callan chances a look behind her, a cul-de-sac. There is no escape that way. The only way out is through. Something in her snapped. Chaos mine-armed. Callan flew out of the alley, dancing on her land spinners as she quickly fired and withdrew her Harkens, spinning her in a twisting, erratic pattern through the throng of clumsy, malformed troglodytes waiting for her out in the street. The army of gun rust surged around her, aiming their guns and grabbing for her with their manipulators, and the sky exploded. White-hot fragments of near-molten shrapnel ripped through the compacted horde, scything through the first ranks in a scream of shearing metal as the always volatile Sakuradite drives cooked off in a series of sympathetic detonations. Her hands dipped down to the holsters at her hips as she hurled herself into the panicking throng of shit-eating cowards who thought they'd cornered her and strike mace-armed. Callan lashed out, a club of super-heavy, durable, metal slamming down on the necklace head of the first gun ruining her path, smashing the steel cranium that might as well have been eggshell with ease and pulping the pilot within. The pipe, heavy and rusted, jolts against her hands as she brings it down again and again and again, sending shocks of impact into her arms until her fingers grow too numb and the pipe flies from them, disappearing into the gloom. She laughed with the childlike joy of murder, smashing through the horde absent of any hint of finesse or grace, reveling in the brutality of the slaughter. She killed, and she killed, and she killed, and nothing satisfied her. Every stick of fuel was only further kindling, sending the fires of heaven scorching through her soul as she killed again and again. When her clubs snapped, the ultra-durable composite finding its limits, Callan resorted to her fists. When her fists broke, useless dented steel joints hanging from cables like ripped tendons, she lashed out with her Harkens. When her land spinners broke, she charged at the pitiful bastards who tried to retreat, pounding them down and dragging them to asphalt with her, where their awkward tripod legs and weak-clawed manipulators had no hope of holding her at bay. Callan howled, she screamed, she even sung in a moment of lunacy, and through it all her soul rose in exultation. Snarling, Callan uses her teeth instead, biting and gouging and clawing and wondering where Naoto is, where her big brother is, and why he isn't here to help her when she is alone and there are so many. And then, the darkness returned. For a moment, Callan continued to jerk and pull at the control sticks, trying to find more enemies, trying to find fresh blood. Slowly, awareness flooded back in, and she let go of the sweat-slick controls, flinching away as if they had burnt her. The whole cockpit stunk of sweat and copper, she realized, and her mouth tasted like blood. Her clothes stuck uncomfortably to her skin. Suddenly, Callan felt exhausted, every muscle taxed and worn down to quivering jelly. She sucked down greedy breaths, trying to calm herself as tiny shuddering tremors racked her body. Something had gone wrong, but she couldn't remember what. All she could focus on was the need to inflict further violence coming from deep within. As the door to simulator pod number 11 opened, the lights of the gymnasium flooded into the tiny space, wrenching Callan back into the present. Dimly, through the blood hammering in her ears, Callan could hear the sounds of cheering and applause. To her faint horror, she could hear the same chant that had driven her up the steps of the stage mixed into those cheers. Callan. 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 She frowned. Before, the chant had been strident and demanding, a hungry flail of public opinion and pressure forcing her onwards. Now, as she unlatched the harness holding her in the simulator's throne, the tone was undeniably celebratory. As Callan staggered to her feet and down the stairs, the chant swelled in volume before collapsing into an incoherent shriek of celebration, so loud it almost battered her down to her feet. She blinked mutely at the horde of blurry faces through eyes teary from sweat. Are they all cheering for me? Callan's thoughts came slowly and somehow felt distant, as if she'd snuck into her big bro's secret stash of moonshine again. Why? What did I do? Numbly, she looked up at the screen standing in front of the line of simulators as Major Pitt thumped her shoulder in congratulation. There on the screen were her initials, and next to them were... Oh. So that's why they're cheering. A wave of nausea struck Callan like a fist and she swayed on her feet, her eyes glued to the screen. The average Ashford student had killed between 2 to 3 enemies and had lasted 5 minutes. To her shock, Callan found that somehow 50 minutes had passed while she was in that tiny sweat-stinking box, and that she'd killed no fewer than 37 enemies in that simulated hell. Oh. Fuck. 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 I fucked up. I fucked up bad. She had succeeded beyond her wildest dreams. She had failed in every way that mattered. Because every disaster, no matter how dire, can always take a turn for the worse. That was when Millie suddenly bloomed into existence, springing into Callan's peripheral vision next to the unremarkable features of Major Pitt. Slowly, Callan turned from the screen towards her mismatched tormentors. Callan frowned. Millie's lips were moving, but she couldn't hear what the Harridan was saying. So she stopped, realizing that her mouth was full of blood seeping from her cut lip. Instinctively, she turned and spat the mouthful of blood onto the smooth-polished boards of the Ashford Academy gymnasium, idly wiping at her mouth with her arm as she turned back towards Millie. Shit, Callan thought vaguely, I smeared blood all over my blazer. That's gonna be a bitch to get out. She blinked, realizing she'd said her last sentence out loud, before shrugging and continuing on. She was having a very difficult time caring about anything at all at the moment. Sorry Millie, I didn't hear you. What was that you just said? Oh. Millie tore herself away from the bloody smear on the floor, her eyes strangely wide to Callan and her cheer even more obviously forced than before. Callan idly wondered if the Academy's president had ever seen blood before. Well, I just wanted to congratulate you on winning your date with Lulu. Aren't you happy? You've got a guaranteed dinner date locked in with the Academy's most eligible bachelor. Callan goggled at the other woman, trying to figure out what planet she dropped down from. She blinked, and the space behind her eyes was full of men and machines, all the same, and all trying to pull her down. She blinked again and Millie was still there, clearly waiting for an answer. Major Pitt lurked behind her, a man who was somehow just as grey as the uniform he wore in Callan's eyes. Fuck the date, Callan growled without thinking, and fuck you too, Ashford. I'm fucking sick of you treating me like a goddamn puppet for your petty fucking games. I did this for me, so everyone else can fuck right off. For a timeless moment, all Callan could feel was a twisting satisfaction as Millie stumbled back, one hand half raised as if she was trying to protect herself or perhaps to reach out to Callan. Under her makeup, her face had gone bloodlessly white and her eyes were wide and hurt. Then, someone muttered a surprised curse, and Callan abruptly realized that the gymnasium had fallen completely silent and that every eye in attendance was fixed on her. Even the blind girl in the wheelchair she'd noticed earlier was oriented her way. Worst of all was the speculative gleam in Major Pitt's unremarkable brown eyes. He wasn't looking at anybody, least of all the Ashford heiress standing next to him. Instead, he was looking at her with undisguised interest. Suddenly, it was all too much. Callan turned on her heel and half stumbled, half ran out of the hauntingly silent gymnasium, away from the stricken Millie Ashford and away from the horribly intrigued eyes of the Britannian Major. She ran into the first bathroom she could find, slamming the stall door shut behind her and pulling her legs up into her chest as the stress of the afternoon finally overwhelmed her completely. When Callan's tremors finally released her and when she'd cleaned her face and fixed her makeup and hair, Major Pitt was leaning against the wall outside the door to the ladies' room, clearly waiting for her. I think, the recruiting officer began, that it's time we had a talk about your future career in the Nightmare Corps, Lady Stadtfeld. May 4, 2016 ATB, Ashford Academy, Tokyo Settlement. 1810. Come on. Pick up. Pick up, damn it. Anxiously, Callan checked her watch. It would be 4 in the morning in New Leicester, or 3 in the morning in the imperial capital of Pendragon. Come on. Wake up. Please wake up. Finally, after a seemingly endless series of rings, the line picked up. Callan's heart leapt into her throat, but she forced herself to continue breathing slowly and steadily. I need to stay calm, she told herself. If I sound calm and deliberate, he'll take me seriously. He'll have to. Callan? A groggy voice asked, and Callan could almost imagine the man at the other end checking his bedside clock. Are you all right? It's a bit early for a social call. Did you forget your time zones? No, Callan snapped, before forcing herself to calm down and lower her voice, very aware that Major Pitt was, in all likelihood, still on the other side of the closed door at the end of the room. He'd been all but attached to her for the last 2 hours, badgering her about the many benefits of the ROTC program and how far she could go in the Nightmare Corps. He'd only grudgingly allowed her out of his sight to make her phone call. I wonder if he thinks I'll try to escape out the window? I can't deny that the thoughts crossed my mind. No, she repeated, I know it's pretty early for a call. But it couldn't wait, the voice sighed, its owner clearly resigned to the fact that further sleep wasn't in the cards. All right Callan, I'll be right with you. Let this old man get some coffee on board, and then we can talk about the situation. Thanks, Callan sighed into the phone, annoyed by how she already felt more at ease with the situation after talking with the man on the other end of the line. Sorry to wake you up so early, Dad. 10 minutes later, Alvin Stadtfeld, Baron of New Leicester and head of House Stadtfeld, came back on the line. All right, I'm feeling marginally awake now. The tired drawl hadn't quite left his voice, but Callan could hear her father's typically amiable tones slowly reasserting themselves as the caffeine began to kick in. So, Callan, my beloved daughter, what's gone so wrong that you couldn't let these old bones sleep for another 4 hours, especially after months without a single text? Yeah, Callan shifted uneasily, put on the spot from across the Pacific Ocean by her father's easily envisioned gimlet eye. A moment later, she scowled as she realized what she was doing. I don't owe him a thing after he abandoned Naoto and me for years. Well, about that. It's kind of a long story. And yet, you, of all people, felt it necessary to wake me up at 3 in the morning. Normally, getting you to talk to me is like pulling teeth, her father rejoined, and Callan could just hear the wry smile on his lips, which means this is important, and you know it's important. So, come on, tell me. How can your father help you, Callan? It would almost be easier if he was just open about being an asshole, she reflected. It's when he actually sounds like he cares, actually seems like he cares, that it's harder to deal with him. In a moment of reflection, Callan remembered how her best friend had never met her own father, and in fact didn't even know who her own father was because he had been a random Britannian bastard just looking for a quick fuck with a broken condom. Her gut twisted, and suddenly Callan felt ashamed. Tanya actually has an asshole father, Callan reminded herself. I don't have any room to complain. At least Dad tried, kinda. I mean, Naoto likes him, so. Fine. Damn it. All right, Callan began, cramming her baggage to the back of her mind. It could wait until after she no longer had to worry about Major Pitt forcing her into the army. So, for some reason, an army recruiter came to my school today and kinda forced everyone to try out the Nightmare Simulator. And, I apparently did good. Really good. And now he's trying to force me to join the ROTC program that he just started today here on campus. So, let me get this straight, Alvin Stadtfeld sighed, taking a long sip of coffee before continuing. Your school, a private school that does not take any imperial subsidies and offers no ROTC program, which I know because I checked before enrolling you there, has suddenly been arm-twisted into starting up an ROTC program, and now you're being badgered by some puffed-up major who won't leave you alone. Why yeah, Callan confirmed, blinking with surprise at how hard her father's voice had grown as he recontextualized her problem. I mean, there's a bit more to it. I think this might have been the Viceroy's idea. The recruiter, Major Pitt, read a speech he claimed came straight from the prince that mentioned Ashford by name. Also, Millie, that's the president's granddaughter, looked really scared when people started refusing to get in the simulator. Over the line, her father hummed thoughtfully to himself. All right, now, what are your thoughts on the matter, Callan? About what? She asked, before wincing slightly at how loud she'd been, casting an anxious glance at the sealed door. About what? She repeated more quietly, the stupid assembly. Or joining the army? Both, I suppose, her father said idly, his mild tone not giving her any clues about his own thoughts. But you wouldn't have called me if the situation wasn't urgent, would you now? So, let me rephrase myself. Do you want to join ROTC and presumably the army, Callan? And do you want my thoughts on the matter? Callan quickly mulled the matter over. Do I even care about his opinion? He's just another Britannian aristocrat, only out to protect and boost his own personal status. He sure as shit doesn't care about us. Otherwise, he would have stayed. But as soon as the thought passed through Callan's head, she remembered all of the times Naoto, her big bro, had stepped up for their father. Dad cares. It's why he came back, Callan. It's also why he had to leave. To keep us safe. She clenched her free hand into a fist. Why can't I just hate him? It would make things so much easier. Yeah, sure, I guess, she said out loud, trying not to sound too interested. What do you think about all of this? Well, Alvin replied dryly, I seem to remember hearing that Area 11 is still experiencing some rather unfortunate domestic troubles, correct? Troubles bad enough to wipe out entire units of nightmares, which are typically in short supply in occupation garrisons. I also know that Prince Clovis has many rivals amongst his royal siblings who would love to assume the vice-regal governorship in his wake. Yes, court politics are always going on, Callan interrupted impatiently, but how does that lead to some pig in a uniform showing up at my school? Well, why does a farmer eat his seed corn? Her father asked rhetorically. It sounds to me like someone in the area administration, maybe His Highness himself, is getting anxious about his supply of devices on hand and is trying to increase that supply via aggressive recruitment. If this is true, it also indicates that His Highness or his advisors aren't expecting many new devices from the homeland. This priority is seemingly high enough to justify some level of coercion to force even high-caliber schools that aren't financially beholden to accept on-campus recruiters. Huh? That's really interesting. Something Tanya needs to know. Fascinating, I guess. If the powers that be are really desperate for devices, then it's a good time to join up, right? Well, there are some undeniable benefits, Alvin mused, sipping at his coffee again. I can't fully endorse you joining the service as my sole heir, especially since you don't have a child, or if you do, I'm going to have words with Nathan, but there are benefits. If you serve as a devicer, you would accrue a knighthood in your own right, as well as a barony once I'm gone. Serving in the army is an excellent path to power, military as well as social and political. Even economic. It would, he continued, also help burnish up your own loyal image, Callan. If one day someone examines your documentation and finds a discrepancy, and if someone questions our claim that Alicia is your mother, an honorable service record will help ameliorate any stain on your reputation. That's probably true, Callan admitted. And if I'm in the service, I don't need to worry about marriage offers, huh? Since I can just say I'm married to my nightmare or some other garbage. You could certainly say that, her father chuckled, before yawning, but honestly, that's something you don't need to worry about, Callan. I'll be able to keep all of the old bats in the attic for the next decade at least, and even if I didn't, Nathan would run interference for you. Besides, he chuckled again, I know you'd probably knife me if I ever tried to force you into a wedding dress, Callie. Shut up. Callan growled into the phone, trying to ignore the deep pang of emotions she didn't want to think about at the mention of her childhood nickname, of the name her father had called her by before he'd abandoned her and Naoto and their mother in a neighborhood full of bullies and bastards. Don't fucking call me that, Dad. All right, as you wish, he sighed tiredly. Anyway, those are my thoughts about the army. It could benefit you in a number of ways, great and small. And it would benefit our house too, wouldn't it? Callan asked, unable to resist the small dig. After all, that's what's important, right? Anything to make sure that the Stadtfeld name is free from any blemish. If the heir had a reputation strengthened by honorable military service, that would benefit House Stadtfeld, Alvin acknowledged, not bothering to deny it. But, that's neither here nor there. I'm only slightly less interested in trying to force you into a marriage than I am in trying to force you into a uniform. What do you think, Callan? Do you want to join the army after you finish school? I don't know, Callan replied half-truthfully. I haven't really thought about what I want to do after I graduate. That's still 2 years away and all. I haven't thought about the army at all. It could have some advantages, she acknowledged. Nightmare training could come in handy, along with learning how the Britannians communicate and think. And I guess I could learn to shoot just as well in the army as I could at the school. But fighting for the Empire, in their uniform? Ugh. But either way, Callan rallied, summoning her anger back with ease. I'm not interested in being harassed into signing up. It's going to be my choice. All right, her father replied after a moment. So, what do you want me to do about this recruiter, this Major Pitt, she supplied. Thank you, he said. Now, what would you like me to do about this Major Pitt, Callan? If you want, I can lean on him, so to speak. Pull some strings back home and take pressure off you. I guess that would help, Callan admitted, suddenly unsure of what exactly she did want. What the hell was I expecting when I called him? That he'd just wave a magic wand or something and this would all go away? I don't really know what I should do. Do what you think is best for yourself, Callan, Alvin said, a sort of tiredness entering his voice that sounded much heavier than his previous sleepiness. Just make sure you can still live in your own skin afterward. And come back home safe, for your mother's sake if not for mine. Callan swallowed, the mention of her mother even from her father's mouth bringing a painful lump into her throat. I'll try. Both Naruto and I are in a war against the most powerful empire on the planet, she thought. What happens to Mom if we both die? The bitch will just throw her out, at the very least. Tanya would probably take her in. She stuck up for her that one time. But that's if Tanya's still alive. I suppose that's all I can ask, Alvin sighed. Well, you've heard my thoughts, Callan. Whatever your choice, I'll support you. After a pause, he continued. I love you, Callan. You know that, right? Thanks for the advice, Dad, Callan replied, gulping slightly as she realized she meant it sincerely. I'll let you know what I choose to do. Don't be a stranger. With a tap, Callan ended the call and collapsed into one of the luxurious couches scattered around this parlor. I hope Millie hasn't done anything weird on this one, she thought idly, letting herself go boneless as she breathed out the emotional turbulence speaking with her father always stirred up. I'm so definitely not in the mood for any of that shit. Not now, probably not ever. With a weary sigh, Callan brought her phone up and dialed another contact, this one listed under a false name with the initials TH. The recipient picked up the phone immediately. Callan. What's the situation? Callan almost gasped as Tanya's cold, clear voice cut through the haze of confusion filling her head. Tanya, she began, speaking in Britannian just in case Major Pitt truly was at the door, ear pressed to the wood. There was a recruitment event at Ashford today, and I couldn't get out of it. They put me in a KMF simulator and I, kinda freaked out but I still did really good. Too good. They want me to join ROTC and the army. What do I do? Someone's close enough to hear you, I take it, but you think that your line is clear enough to reach out for advice, Tanya said, immediately grasping the situation. I understand. Are there any signs that they know anything about your other background? No, they haven't been making any threats or anything, not yet at least. Callan took a calming breath, trying to slow her nervous tongue. That said, the recruiter's been giving me the soft sell for the last 2 hours. And back during the event, Millie looked really nervous when he started to frown. I get the feeling that if I don't say yes, they're going to try to make me. I understand, Tanya repeated. In that case, go for it. Wait, what? Callan blurted, shocked by the conversation's sudden turn. You want me to agree? I do, Tanya said smoothly, her tone clipped and precise. Listen to me carefully, Callan. I know you are more of a warrior than a spy by inclination. Despite this, you have performed admirably so far. Good work always earns more work, though, so, I am tasking you with a new mission. You will become a soldier, moreover, you will be the best soldier you can be. You will learn all that you can from the Britannians. You will be as Britannian as possible. You will be Cadet Callan Stadtfeld. And then one day, when the time comes, you will come home to us, to your brother and I. You will become Kozuki Callan once again. And you will come back with the expertise of a Britannian devicer, brimming with knowledge about our enemy. This will be a difficult mission, I'm asking much from you. But your credo is anything for the cause, and I am certain, Callan, that you'll live up to it. You've never failed anything I've asked you to do before now. Do you accept this mission, Callan? She felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff. She couldn't see the bottom. She desperately wanted to step back, to say that she couldn't do it, couldn't take the plunge. But you know that you can, a treacherous, cruel voice said from inside her. Perhaps it was just her emotional strength failing her after a long, trying day, but Callan couldn't help but listen to it. You know you can do it and nobody else can. Anything for the cause. Duty is a mountain. There is nobody else who can pick up this mountain. This is your sacrifice. If you step back now, you have betrayed everything you've ever said about your duty, your dedication. Your mistress has given you an order. A good soldier obeys her orders. Yes, Callan said, her tongue like lead. Yes, I'll do it. Good. The clear voice was sharp-edged in its purity, free of any touch of regret or any second guesses. Then you must cut off all contact with us? Give the Britannians no reason to suspect your loyalty. Delete my contact, and Ogi's and Naoto's. If you must pass us a message, hand it to Rivals and tell him to pass it on to Ino. And Tanya's voice softened, don't worry about your mother or your brother. I'll go to the Stadtfeld mansion this very night with Naoto, and we'll bring her back with us. She won't be staying in Shinjuku, she'll be going someplace that's safe, far from the Britannians, far from your stepmother. I'll be sending Naoto out into the countryside too. You won't need to worry about them, Callan, I promise. Will I need to worry about you? The words were out of her mouth before she could think about them, but Callan couldn't find it in herself to recall them. Was this really the last conversation she would have with her friend? Surely not. Anything for the cause, Tanya replied. If Naoto is going out of Shinjuku to assist Ogi with our program outside of the ghetto, someone needs to stay behind to maintain the chain of command. Just as you have your duty, so too do I have mine. Of course that's what she would say. I don't know what else I expected. But, Tanya added, I'll likely be busy with my leadership duties. I doubt I'll have much time for frontline work in the foreseeable future. For some reason, she sounded oddly wistful. You don't need to worry about me, Callan. Do your duty and I'll do mine, we will meet again. If you say so, Callan replied. She chanced another look at the closed door, there were no signs of any eavesdroppers. Nevertheless, she dropped her voice down to a whisper and turned away from the door, tucking the phone up close to her mouth as she lowered her face into the pillows. Then, in Japanese, she bid her leader a farewell in the language of duty. Long live Japan. May 6, 2016 ATB, Ashford Academy, Tokyo Settlement. 0900. For the second time in a week, Callan found herself standing up on a stage in front of the Ashford student body. This time, instead of joining Millie and Lelouch on a commentator's perch overlooking the gymnasium, she stood front and center on the school theater's stage, a line of 6 of her fellow students behind her. And, instead of facing the student body directly as she had before, this time Callan was only facing Major Pitt. Look on the bright side, Callan thought sarcastically, at least they aren't looking at you with the same disgusting eyes as before. That's probably just the uniform, though. Hell, that's a silver lining right there. I don't have to wear something designed by Millie Ashford any longer. In place of the Ashford Academy creme blazer and navy blue miniskirt, Callan and the other 6 members of the inaugural cohort of the Ashford ROTC program wore their newly issued formal uniforms. The 5 boys had uniform slacks while Callan and the one other girl wore knee-length skirts, all in the same uniform grey of their uniform jackets, unadorned save for their shiny leather belts and the yellow stripes proclaiming their status as trainees. The change in uniform was a vanishingly thin silver lining, though. Considering what Callan was about to do, what she was about to swear, she'd almost be happy to wear anything Millie so chose if it meant that the last 3 days could somehow be undone, that her leader's final order could be recalled. Almost. At a subtle nod from Major Pitt, Callan's right arm snapped up to a right angle, hand over her heart and elbow straight up. Her left arm was at her side, her garrison cap cradled at hip height. Just as she'd rehearsed for the last hour. Her last hour as a civilian, free from the confines of His Majesty's Armed Forces. While she'd still be attending classes at Ashford Academy and sleeping in her bedroom on weeknights, her weekends and holidays belonged to the army now. As did the next 10 years of her life. Until I take them back, Callan reminded herself. This is all a ruse, all a deception. Don't forget that, Callan. You aren't Britannian. You will never be Britannian, not where it matters. All for the cause, anything for the cause. Even this. Do you, Major Pitt began, Lady Kallenstadtfeld, swear your allegiance to His Imperial Majesty and to his empire? I, Kallenstadtfeld, swear by Almighty God that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to His Imperial Majesty Emperor Charles Z. Britannia, and to his heirs, and to the empire he rules. The words rolled off Callan's tongue with a solemn gravitas heated by passionate ardor. They tasted like ashes. Do you, Major Pitt continued, swear to defend his crown, his dignity, and his mandate against all his enemies? I, Kallenstadtfeld, swear by Almighty God that I will, as in duty bound, zealously and faithfully defend His Imperial Majesty, his heirs, his crown and his dignity, and his mandate, against all his enemies. Callan stared straight into Pitt's eyes, unable to blink or look away, trying her best to convey a fidelity with feet of clay to her new commanding officer, her new superior. Never my leader. Never my lord. Never my master. Do you, Major Pitt asked, swear to obey all orders of His Imperial Majesty, his heirs, and his generals and officers set over you? I, Kallenstadtfeld, swear by Almighty God that I will obey any and all orders of His Imperial Majesty, his heirs, and his appointed generals and officers set over me, without objection or dissent. I pledge my life, my land, and my sacred honor to His Imperial Majesty, until such time as he sees fit to free me from this solemn bond. As she publicly announced her loyalty with every intention of breaking her vows, Callan extended her right arm up and out, until it was straight out in front of her, pointing above Pitt's head. Even though Britannian history claimed that they had driven Caesar and his legions from their shores, the Britannian Empire had still made the Romans salute their own at some point. Then it is with pride that I, Major Phineas Pitt, accept your oath of loyalty on His Imperial Majesty's behalf, the officer intoned, raising his arm to mirror hers. We shall exchange loyalty for fidelity, honor for honor, and blood for treachery. We name you Cadet Kallenstadtfeld, and in recognition of your achievement and noble descent elevate you to Cadet Sergeant Kallenstadtfeld. Long may you serve our empire. With that, and with the storm of applause from the audience, it was done. Callan stepped back into line as the next cadet stepped forth to take the oath. There was no going back now. She had pledged herself to the service of the enemy. She was a soldier of Britannia. May 4, 2016 ATB, Ashford Academy, Tokyo Settlement. 1625. That, Lelouch thought as the gymnasium's door swung shut behind Kallenstadtfeld, sounds like it was a long time coming. It was all he could do to force his typical mask of serenity into place in the aftermath of Callan's riveting performance. The newly discovered natural nightmare talent had been magnificent in her anger, ripping into Millie with all the rage of a wolf brought to bay. Watching Millie be taken to account for hauling them both up on stage had been immensely cathartic. And frankly, she's lucky that Callan just settled for a spot of public humiliation. After all, he mused, the spotlight has an unfortunate habit of illuminating secrets best left in the dark. It took Millie less than a minute to regain her composure and laugh the whole incident off, declaring it a byproduct of adrenaline overdose, effectively wiping away Callan's social transgression from the student body's guppy-like collective memory. After all, Millie goaded, if the delicate Lady Stadtfeld can manage such an upset, then surely all you big strong boys can as well. Predictably and perhaps naturally, the collective male ego of half of his so-called peers rankled at being upstaged in their domain of war. The usual chest beating had ensued as boys who had already had a try with the simulators lined up anew for a second chance at glory, all under the paternal gaze of Major Pitt. Spoiled children, the lot of them, and idiots too, Lelouch thought disgustedly. Also eager to die for the sake of that man, who wouldn't even blink as he sacrificed 10 times their number on a whim. I doubt any of them have so much as smelled the aftermath of a minor skirmish, much less a battlefield. Certainly, none of them had walked through killing fields days after the front had moved on. Nobody who had seen the rats scrambling to their feasts would ever be so eager to find glory ever again. Finally, even that fresh wave of ardor dissipated, bringing the long assembly to a conclusion. Freed from the prying eyes of his classmates, Lelouch finally gave himself license to glare at Millie from across the gymnasium, letting the weight of his displeasure be known. There were some advantages to an education in royal etiquette, abbreviated as it had been. His outrage wasn't lost on the target of his ire, who blushed shamefacedly and all but scampered out of the gymnasium, escaping out onto the Academy's verdant quad. Lelouch was not particularly worried. He knew where she would go, and what room he would find her in. Lelouch, Nunnally whispered, grabbing his hand before he could pursue the fleeing Millie. Lelouch started. He hadn't even heard her wheelchair roll up beside him. Let it go. She must have had her reasons. She went too far, he said, not bothering to conceal his wrath with only his sister in earshot. I can't let it go. Not this time. Nunnally sighed in disappointment, and his anger recoiled. Give her a chance to explain herself then, at the very least. She is our hostess. You must not forget that. More than her disappointment, Nunnally's admonishments stung him to the quick. The last time he had forgotten his place, they had both been sent to die in a war zone for his impertinence. What had happened once could happen again. It would only take one misstep with the Ashfords for them to decide the risk of harboring them was too great and to cast the Vi Britannias back out into the cold and unforgiving outside world. I will come with you, Nunnally declared. Lelouch scowled. I don't. You are reckless and relentless, big brother. Nunnally easily rolled over his half-spoken protest. Your mind latches onto ideas and refuses to let them go. You do not know when to stop, and you have never learned that you do not need to achieve victory to avoid losing. Draws are irritating, Lelouch grumbled, but the anger was already withdrawing, allowing him to breathe easily once more. Somehow, whenever they squabbled, Nunnally always won. He could never deny her anything she wanted. Except, of course, the one thing that she truly wants. He sighed and began walking towards the gymnasium's exit, Nunnally easily keeping by his side in her chair. This was, he had to admit, her fight as well. There was no point trying to keep her out of it now. Besides, she had been just as threatened by Millie's foolhardy antics as he had. She had every right to claim her pound of flesh, should she so choose. Very well. I happen to like drawers, his darling sister said cheerfully as they left the gym, still lined with the simulator pods, behind them. Of course you do, he said indulgently, shaking his head. She has always lacked the killer instinct. It's for the best. I think it's quite balanced, Nunnally insisted, somehow just as aware of his thoughts as always. Both sides survive and work together to reach a mutually agreeable solution. He bit down on his sarcastic rebuke. She could afford to be happy in her innocence. They were not a court, where such idealism brought only ruin and was harshly punished at every turn. What would they do to you, Nunnally? I can never let it happen. Never. He felt his anger returning and forced himself to focus on his sister's chatter instead. It's like two birds building a nest, she said by way of explanation. They both need to help out or it doesn't work for either of them. It is fortunate, he jibed, entirely unable to stop himself, that birds don't go to war. Lelouch. The swat on his wrist was practically avian in its insubstantiality, in its frailty. She is so weak, and so horribly, horribly fragile. Sorry, he begged her forgiveness with a laugh, but were a bird to betray its mate, then? Lelouch. Nunnally huffed and accelerated her motorized wheelchair. You are far too young to be a grouchy old man. They're birds. They're cute. And have beautiful songs. And they do this most wonderful mating dance. Just like Millie, flamboyantly vibrant and dancing just out of the reach of her many suitors and admirers. Maybe if she wasn't so distracted with her petty displays and distractions, he could be enjoying the day like the students sprawled out across the luxurious campus, enjoying the bright sun of a late spring afternoon. Maybe he could focus on his sister and her recitation of all that she knew about birds instead of wondering what sounds Millie would make upon a rack. My mother was gentle and kind, for all that her enemies hated her. His thoughts were cold and distant, but far from clinically detached. And yet, for all that they hated her, they feared the Flash both for her battlefield skills and for her inventive punishments. Perhaps some of her old tricks would help Millie learn? After all, even apt students require correction. Perhaps her scheming would be aided by a taste of the courtly fear so endemic amongst the true nobility. Lost in his dark thoughts, Lelouch was almost surprised to find himself in front of the pink-painted door of the student council's favorite conference room, on the first floor of the clubhouse. Lelouch, Nunnally spoke up from beside him, tugging insistently at his jacket sleeve. Hey Lelouch. She's inside already. Remember. The burnished handle of the conference room door beckoned. The bronze was warm under his hand. I know. We owe the Ashfords a great deal. A great deal indeed. Reuben had been good to them for years, his loyalty to their deceased mother stretching far beyond anything Lelouch found explicable. The only rationale Lelouch could assign to the old man's protection was his political aspirations. It was so easy to go from being in someone's debt to being under their thumb, and if Lelouch or Nunnally ascended the throne under the Ashford patriarch's supervision, all that his house had lost and more would be theirs once again. But that was far off in the distance, a long shot at best. Here in the present, Millie was the anointed heir to the Ashford holdings. What remained of them, her disappointing parents passed over. Lelouch and Nunnally, on the other hand, were worse than useless to the Ashfords. They were active liabilities unless that long shot paid off. And so it behooves me to remember my place. Not that such wisdom has ever truly held me back, oh no, perish the thought. Just like how Nunnally and I nearly perished because of my foolish pride. Good afternoon, Madam President Lelouch. From the head of the table, Millie smiled at them, a strained, bleached thing. And Nunnally. Nunnally's smile was a potent weapon indeed, Lelouch knew from long experience. It could be as sweet and treacherous as an angel's lie and just as barbed as any fishhook when her occasional fey moods took her. Now, that guileless expression was cutting as it smoothly transitioned from polite greeting to disappointed pity. Would you perhaps elucidate your thought process this afternoon? Lelouch asked, his tone as polished as any of that man's lickspittle courtiers. I had not been informed that I would be called upon to fulfill my duties as the Vice President, nor that such duties included being paraded before one of His Majesty's glorious and honorable men. Does any man ever really know when duty will call? Millie replied, aiming for breezy but shooting into tempestuous. The tension in the room undermined her attempt to inject levity. Lelouch simply remained patiently silent, aware of his sister's presence at his arm. After a moment, Millie tried again. Look, it's been a stressful day for all of us. I'm not feeling particularly splendid at the moment myself. I don't suppose there's any chance we can pick this up later? That, Lelouch decided, was the wrong answer. Millicent Ashford, he ground out, manners held only by a thread and the light touch of fingers on his hand. There is no time quite like the present to discuss just how little I care about how splendid or otherwise you are feeling. You damn near served Nunnally and me up to the army today, on the inaugural Vi Britannia Day of all possible days. Do you understand what you put at risk with your ingenious plan? Do you understand what I had at stake? Millie shot back, her voice high and thrumming with tension. Do you think Grandpa and I just let the army show up on a whim? Absolutely not. They applied pressure, and we were given the choice of participation or investigation. Millie's voice had begun to creep upwards towards a high, almost hysterical note. That joyless prig of a major showed up just this morning in my grandfather's office, she continued, with an entire truckload of simulators parked outside and a letter with the vice-regal governor's seal requesting we consider partnering with the army to open a ROTC branch on campus. When Grandpa declined, Pitt threatened to investigate our lack of patriotism and determine whether Ashford Academy required new leadership. She's terrified, Lelouch realized, noticing how Millie's perfectly manicured hands had curled into tight white-knuckled balls as she had ranted. Pitt must have made quite the impression. Fear is a disease, and Lelouch had to resist succumbing to Millie's anxiety as he imagined what sort of pressure Major Pitt must have brought to bear to convince Reuben Ashford. And what, he quietly replied, did he demand in exchange for withholding the investigation, Millie? I assume consideration was not the half of it. A branch of the ROTC opened on campus with dedicated grounds, which means the equestrian club can kiss their back pasture goodbye, Millie replied, ticking items off her fingers. A seat for the leader of the ROTC and student government to incentivize participation and ensure that a properly patriotic voice is present, the enthusiastic participation of the student body in any recruitment events, and rubber stamp approval for any would-be recruits who wish to leave school to join the army directly. Oh, and of course, a small remuneratory gift for Major Pitt himself, Millie concluded with a bitter smile, just to reward him for his excellent work, you understand. Quite, Lelouch replied mirthlessly, the price of doing business. And in exchange for all of that? What did you secure from that masterfully negotiated transaction? Don't be difficult, Lulu, Millie sighed, leaning back in her chair. The tension had almost disappeared from her voice, concealed by her usual honeyed tones. Ashford Academy is still Ashford Academy, and will remain free of prying eyes. Splendid, Lelouch replied only half sarcastically. Our secret remains our own for another day. Assuming, of course, that Pit did not recognize me when you hauled me up on stage, an action that seemingly completely undermines your goal to avoid the attention of the authorities. He would have continued, had the fingers that rested lightly on his wrist not tightened and pulled, dragging Lelouch's attention away from the Ashford heiress. Peace, big brother. Nunnally's firm command was unsoftened by the sweet tones of the delivery. Millie is our hostess and our friend, and I am sure she is doing her best in a stressful situation. As you say, Nunnally. The delicate fingers loosened on his wrist, and Lelouch turned back to Millie. I apologize for my disrespect. My point stands, however. What possessed you to haul me up on stage, Millie? What were you thinking? Elevating my profile amongst the school body is one thing, but bringing me to the attention of an army officer? Millie sagged in her chair. That was not my intention, Lelouch, but I saw the lack of enthusiasm, and I saw Pit pulling out his notebook. I had promised him the enthusiastic participation of the students, and they were all shying away, all afraid of the possible humiliation. I had to find something to goad them on with. She gave him a strained smile. You were the first thing I thought of, and I saw a way to get everybody's blood back up. As Millie had recounted the pressure Major Pitt had applied, Lelouch had been temporarily distracted from his anger by the implications of the apparent new recruiting push by the forces garrisoning Area 11. The fact that, according to Millie, Pitt had shown up with a letter bearing the official seal of the vice-regal governor's office all but guaranteed that this project, whatever it was, had the personal blessing of Clovis La Britannia. The student council president's admission that she had pulled him out from the cover of the crowd onto the stage immediately brought that anger back to the surface. I repeat, Lelouch asked, voice heated, what were you thinking, Millie? I was thinking about all of the other students, Lelouch. As always, Millie rose to the challenge. You two might be the biggest secret I'm keeping, but you're far from the only. If Pitt brings his so-called suspicions to the attention of the military police, they would be crawling all over the academy in hours. How many of our students do you think are holding, Lulu? I can tell you if you'd like. And it's not just drugs. How many do you think have questionable literature in their lockers? Probably quite a few, Lelouch grudgingly conceded. Nothing quite like flirting with danger to give a sheltered life meaning, I suppose. Indeed. Millie nodded. You should know, Mr. Illicit Gambler. And once just one of those lockers is found, we will no longer have to worry about the military police because the IDSS will be on hand to investigate potential subversion. And I am sure that you know that, as soon as the witch hunt begins, there will somehow be plenty of witches to find. Tell me, Lelouch, how long do you think the academy you live at would remain open if half of the faculty were arrested for subversion and perverting the minds of the youth with unapproved doctrine? If you had just told me before the assembly, we could have worked something out. Lelouch retorted, temper barely restrained by the gentle fingers on his wrist. If you had told me a display of enthusiasm was required, I would have primed rivals and Shirley and made sure they were at the head of the line. Even if they botched their own simulations, they would have had the sense not to publicly complain about it. And they don't have secrets in need of concealment. That would have worked, Millie admitted with a moderately ashamed smile. But I was panicking, you know? I mean, how was I to know that one of the most incompetent pilots in the whole school would be the first up? And how was I to know that the students would be so fickle? They had the opportunity to pilot nightmares. Why would I expect them to just wimp out like that? Why would you go into any high-stakes engagement without a fallback plan? Lelouch riposted. Why would you stake your family's security and our lives on the reactions of a group of children? Brother. This time, Nunnally didn't bother veiling the iron with velvet. You will remember your manners. This is a discussion between equals and friends, and I will not hear either of you raise your voices. Am I clear? Reluctantly, Lelouch nodded, noting Millie follow suit from the corner of his eye. Thank you. Now, Nunnally turned her smiling face, distinctly chillier than normal, back towards Millie. Millicent Ashford, I am disappointed in you. I expected better. A lady does not panic. A lady always has a plan. Title or not, you are a lady, and I expected you to conduct yourself as such. And most of the idiots at this school think Nunnally is the nice Lamperouge sibling, Lelouch thought sympathetically as Millie all but crumbled at the calm dismissal. Nunnally's only nice as long as you don't make her angry. I know, Millie said with a wince. I just panicked. I thought about soldiers ransacking the academy, and all the students who I know would get arrested. And Grandpa losing everything he managed to save after Her Highness died. And you thought about what you would be losing yourself, should Ashford Academy close, Nunnally continued, remorseless despite her dulcet tones. After all, the academy is just as much a refuge for you as it is from us. Why, it was only last week that your parents called about another potential suitor they had found, was it not? Surely you cannot put them off for much longer, Millie. Yes. Millie half said, half screamed. Yes. I don't want to be married off by my stupid parents, and the academy's the only place where I have anything close to freedom. I don't want to see that get ruined because of some stupid political game the stupid prince is playing. I'm sorry. I'm sorry that I didn't warn you too, and I'm sorry that I pulled you up on stage, Lelouch. Apology accepted. Lelouch cut in before his sister could speak. By us both. Just please, Millie, do better next time. I can't deny her anything, he thought wryly, but I can't deny that Nunnally definitely got some of that man's cruelty as well as Mother's sweetness. His hypocrisy as well. She called me out for my anger at Millie, but she would hurt her far worse than I ever could. Regardless, he continued, striving for something like detachment, what is done, and now we must adjust to recent developments. The most important one being the ticking time bomb in our midst. Bomb? Millie stared at him, outwardly incredulous but with fear flickering in her eyes. Lelouch, after the day I've had, I am far too drained for any more overly dramatic theatrics. I fear that, unless we handle the matter carefully, that bomb will become all too literal, Lelouch said, cutting her off. And frankly, Millie, I am surprised that you are so readily willing to dismiss this threat when you are the one who set her up to explode in all of our faces. Set her? Millie asked, frowning in confusion. Then it hit her. Callan? The student council president reeled back with a gasp. I mean, I know what she did on stage was a bit. A flicker of hurt tugged at the corner of her mask, harsh, but what on earth does that have to do with bombs, Lulu? You truly do not know? Lelouch raised a challenging brow. She seems to have quite the clear opinion of your machinations. Given that we just discussed how many dangerous secrets of the student body you are privy to, I am amazed that you somehow failed to notice exactly what your newest toy was hiding when you decided to play with her. Quite the oversight, Millie. Machinations? Millie all but squawked in protest. Lelouch, I'm not some kind of scheming puppet master who treats people like toys. Besides, she liked it. You feel that you do not treat people as if they were toys? Asked Lelouch, leveling a deeply unimpressed glare at Ashford's queen. Something about the way he'd said that made Millie hesitate. No? Then, Lelouch pressed inexorably on, what do you believe prompted today's performance? I told you, Millie exclaimed, they forced my hand and I panicked. I already apologized for that. Yes, for dragging me on stage, but what about Callan? Not to mention, Lelouch pointed out, that while this time you were pressured into acting, you have pulled the entire academy into some impromptu game purely for your own amusement time and again. An outburst like that is not the product of a single squandered afternoon. I'm just trying to inject a little fun into people's lives, that's all, Millie said, defending herself. School life is so dreary and all the formals that young nobles have to attend are ridiculously stuffy. There's got to be more to that to make young life worth living. The students need more. They need a little adventure. Adventure? Lelouch quietly asked, a cold prickling sensation seeming to dribble over his skin. For a moment, he was almost 11 again, filthy and hungry and bone-weary. You believe they need adventure to give their lives form? Yes, Millie nodded definitively. Adventure, Lelouch. Life, fun, parties, excitement. Teens who aren't sticks in the mud like you happen to love the shows I put on for them. Indeed. Lelouch replied, Callan seems to have really enjoyed your approach to morale-boosting activities for the student body. I believe she made that quite clear today. I don't get it. Millie groaned, flushing red at the memory of Callan's adamant rejection. She always enjoyed everything else I did. Why did she just suddenly flip out this time? And in front of everybody. Geass. Lelouch felt dread shiver down his spine in icy tendrils. Millie, what exactly do you mean by everything else? Oh, you know, Millie said offhandedly, I saw Callan was trying to break into the more popular circles, so I gave her a hand. A salacious grin slipped onto her lips. Well, maybe a few. Even a prude like you has to admit she's filled out quite nicely. An almost spiritual exhaustion washed over Lelouch as he slowly blinked at Millie. So, he finally replied once Millie's words had sunk in, you have been giving Callan the Shirley treatment for the past, what, 7 months now? 8? Lelouch rubbed at his forehead. How are you still alive, Millie? No, do not bother answering. I am shocked it took this long for Stadtfeld to finally snap. Frankly, it is a miracle that no one has died yet. How was I supposed to know she wasn't having fun? Millie plaintively asked, almost wailing. I thought she was having fun. People have fun around me. I'm a fun person. Clearly not according to Callan, Lelouch replied acidly, otherwise, I doubt she would have registered her opinion of you quite so publicly or vehemently. If she didn't like how I treated her, why didn't she just tell me? I thought I was doing exactly what she wanted. She was just trying to be popular and wanted my help, so I helped. Millie sounded genuinely baffled. I mean, I'm super approachable. I try to be super approachable. And who, Lelouch asked, would dare to tell the Academy's queen that she had stepped out of line? Hurt flashed across Millie's face, gone as fast as it had appeared, but Lelouch had still caught the crack in her affable mask. I'm sure I don't know what you're talking about, she rebutted. Really, Millie? Lelouch sighed. You are the student council president, as well as the granddaughter of the principal, who is also the chairman of the board of regents for the school. He shook his head as he carefully explained the obvious. The teachers never put up so much as a peep when you make an announcement. If every authority figure here bends the knee to you, why would any of the students assume you would listen or care about any objections they might voice? She may not be a bad person, Lelouch mused, but Millie is absolutely a spoiled brat. Perhaps this will give her a reason to grow, now that she understands that she can truly hurt people in her enthusiasm. For a moment, he thought he'd gotten through. The hurt blossomed into indignation. Wait a second. That's not something you just came up with. Millie leaned forwards over the table, an accusing finger jabbing aggressively at Lelouch. You knew. You knew people weren't talking to me because they were scared I'd tattle to Grandpa. Why didn't you tell me people weren't having fun? Because I did not want to interrupt your game. Lelouch raised a puzzled eyebrow. Are you implying that I should have stepped in and advised you that most boys do not like being forced into mandatory cross-dressing and most girls do not, in fact, like having their breasts honked from behind by way of greeting? Yes. A tinge of heat touched Millie's cheekbones, unshed tears pooling in her eyes. Yes, Lulu, that would have been good to know. I thought that they were having fun. Why did you think I was doing it? Well, given the way you smile when you grab at people, it seemed obvious that you enjoyed flaunting your dominance over the student body via pseudo-sexual displays as well as demonstrations of authority. I mean, why else would you molest everyone like you owned them? Or constantly interrupt classes for impromptu events dominated by your vivacious personality? Lelouch scanned the frowning Ashford's face, and then looked down into the very unimpressed glare Nunnally was shooting his way. I take it that this was not, in fact, the case? Why did you? Millie shook her head, a frustrated growl slipping out. Right. Raised at the imperial court, and then thrown to the wolves. Of course you would see it all as dominance games. What on earth would all that have been, if not elaborate dominance games? Lelouch wondered, momentarily baffled. No, Lelouch, that was not what I was trying to do. In fact, that was the opposite of what I was trying to accomplish. Millie huffed and looked away, but she couldn't hide the tremor in her voice. I just wanted people to have fun. Is that so wrong? Lelouch didn't know what to say to that. And now I feel like the bastard here. How did she manage that? Did you ever ask what they want? Nunnally's calm voice sliced through the awkward silence. Ask? Millie turned back to give the younger girl a confused look. Lelouch carefully didn't notice the unshed tears at the corners of her eyes. What are you talking about? I ask them all the time. With all due respect, Millie, you do not, Nunnally carefully rebutted, her closed eyes somehow fixed unerringly on Millie's own. You ask them with all the sincerity of a velvet-wrapped fist. When Millicent Ashford asks her subjects if they would like a party, everyone knows what the Queen of the Academy wants as her answer. Who would risk denying her? Millie opened her mouth to argue, but Nunnally continued relentlessly on, an unstoppable force in a frail body. When you play your games, do you ever pause to consider what others truly want? Or do you only think about what you desire? If you do not ask people what they want and give them the latitude to answer honestly, you cannot truly claim to have given them a voice. That comment, uttered in soft soprano, brought Millie up short. For a moment, neither Lelouch nor Millie could say anything, each silent for their own reasons. She has truly grown, hasn't she? Lelouch mused, gazing at his sister with fresh eyes. Even if she speaks with the conviction of naivety, her eloquence befits the royal rank stolen from her. Nunnally, when did you begin to grow so fierce? He sighed. I suppose even a bird with broken wings can develop sharp spurs. But please, save your spurs for a more deserving target. Even our best intentions can put us on the path to hell if we do not mind our step. Millie has not quite learned that as of yet. Unfortunately ignorant of his silent plea, Nunnally was far from done. Now, big brother, Nunnally's sightless gaze turned back to him. What was this about Callan being a ticking time bomb? Millie stiffened at the reminder. Lelouch felt dread pool in his gut. Pointing this out felt like a win before, Lelouch thought as he silently apologized to Millie. Now, it just feels cruel. But the last thing Millie needs right now is more coddling. And the potential threat is far from insignificant. Right. Well. Lelouch rolled the words around in his head, trying to figure out a way to phrase what had to be said in a manner that would let Millie down gently. He failed. I have reason to believe that Callan may be, perhaps, a Japanese insurgent. Despite her closed lids, Lelouch imagined he could almost see the violet eyes he remembered from their youth, a perfect match to his own. In that imagined image, his darling little sister's gaze bore down upon him with the same fell intensity that his mother could bring to bear, easily winkling the truth out of him no matter how he tried to prevaricate his way to safety. Oh? Nunnally cocked her head, furthering her almost owl-like impression as if she were able to pick him apart by sound alone. And pray tell, big brother, why on earth would you think that? Detecting her nature was far from easy, and I was forced to draw upon many sources to reach the conclusion, Lelouch admitted. She first came to my attention when I thought she was a spy for Clovis. By the way, she most definitely is not, but in clearing her of that charge, I incidentally discovered several factors that lead me to believe that she is probably half Japanese and, if not an outright insurgent, then a sympathizer to their cause. Big brother, did you spy on Lady Stadtfeld due to another fit of paranoia? Nunnally shook her head, clearly disappointed. I had rather thought you had learned your lesson, after the unfortunate incident with the plumber. That plumber had it coming. He was. Lelouch caught the look on Millie's face and stopped himself before he got sidetracked even further. Regardless, he continued with a cough, while I admit that my initial assumption was incorrect, I do not regret investigating her, not after what I found. Oh? And what did you find, big brother? Nunnally was still clearly signaling disappointment, but Lelouch could detect an edge of interest in her familiar voice. I certainly hope that all of your snooping yielded at least something of substance. I began by searching the database of the administration's Ministry of Justice, Lelouch said, skipping over the tedious process of socially engineering his entrance into said database. I wanted to see if she had come to anybody else's notice. Indeed, she has come to the attention of the night police, who have a log of her comings and goings through the checkpoints into Shinjuku. He allowed himself a smile. She makes very frequent visits, it would seem. That's kinda troubling, Millie replied, a hint of a quaver in her voice. Not that she's visiting the ghetto for whatever reason, but that the police are already tracking her movements. Does that mean she's already as good as dead? Lelouch chuckled. No, not quite. For some inexplicable reason, her file has been marked as a classified object, as well as a case not to be investigated. All of the additions and recent edits were made by automated systems monitoring traffic through the checkpoints. Her records are, for all intents and purposes, clean. Her records? Millie interrupted in a haunted voice. Lelouch, taken off guard by her hollow tone, blinked. Her school records? They're doctored, aren't they? Callan's really a bastard? You knew? Lelouch asked. I suspected. Millie offered him a mirthless smile. It's not exactly that rare these days. Children born out of wedlock or to the wrong parents get quietly legitimized fairly often. There are more than a few students at the academy who share her burden. For some, it's something of an open secret, for others, a buried shame. For Callan, I just figured. Millie trailed off, at a clear loss for words, before eventually shrugging helplessly. I guess I just thought it wasn't a big deal. She doesn't act like someone who hates her parents, you know? But, she sighed, I suppose her being Japanese would explain her fixation on 11 and honorary Britannian issues as a journalist. Not to mention her work with the Rising Sun Association. So you know about that as well? Lelouch asked, surprised. Rivals told me. Millie gave him a sad smile. He talks to me a lot, you know. He's very proud of the charity, and he told me all about how he may have set it up, but it was Callan's idea. About how much he runs it. About how passionate she is about helping the 11s. All because I asked him. Millie's smile turned brittle and for a moment it looked like she was about to say something, but at the last moment, she bit her lip and looked away. I see. Lelouch organized his thoughts. Well, did he mention that Callan also speaks fluent Japanese in a Shitamachi dialect? The native Tokyo dialect, he quickly explained, seeing Millie's baffled expression, the one especially used by the middle and lower classes pre-conquest. Millie made a non-committal sound. Not quite. I mean, he said that he heard her speaking in Japanese once and that she sounded pretty smooth, but Rivals obviously doesn't speak it himself. If she is a half-breed, I suppose it makes sense she'd speak her mother tongue. By any chance, Lelouch asked, did he mention that the Rising Sun Benevolent Association is almost certainly a front for insurrectionists? Millie's head snapped up, fear blazing in her eyes. What? By any chance, did Rivals mention that Callan had a little confrontation with a group of thugs at one of their outdoor soup kitchens the other day? Lelouch mused aloud. At Millie's confirming nod, he continued, I was watching when that happened. Those were no mere thugs. I have absolutely no doubt that they were honorary Britannian soldiers out of uniform and that the members of Rising Sun were entirely prepared to shoot them. Lelouch's fist clenched at the memory of that thing wearing his dear friend's face. Oh Suzaku, what has happened to you? Even if they were garden variety criminals, Lelouch continued, the fact that Japanese, 11s to be precise, had access to guns and the capacity to smuggle them through the ghetto's checkpoints indicates that they are either a highly organized criminal group or affiliated with one of the myriad factions of the Japanese resistance. Considering their charitable actions outside their native territory of Shinjuku, I am inclined towards the latter. Although, somebody had to have put that hold on Callan's official file, somebody with sufficient access to tamper with its classification. That does not sound like something the Japanese rebels up in the mountains would be capable of, and if they were, I doubt that they would use their skills to cover for a half-breed. Which might indicate that somebody's on the take inside the administration, hinting at potential criminal activity. Given that Rivals neglected to mention your presence as well, I am willing to venture that you had been following Lady Stadtfeld in disguise, Nunnally stated, shooting him a disappointed look. My big brother, stalking young maidens through the streets like some sad, desperate beast. Nunnally let out a long, hopeless sigh that actually managed to tug at Lelouch's heart, to his great irritation. Maybe I should do less creeping about? Lelouch wondered, then tried to shake the thought from his head. No, no. I'm not going to let my sister chide me into being less thorough, even if it would make her happier. No. This manipulation is as blatant as it is cheap. You will have to do better than that, my darling little sister. Regardless, Lelouch continued out loud, what Rivals likely further failed to notice is that, while Callan was standing up to the soldiers, all of her Japanese companions were preparing to kill at her command. He locked eyes with Millie, trying to impress upon her the implications of that moment. They weren't just subtly reaching below their aprons for guns, others were taking quiet steps to flank the soldiers. All of them hanging on Callan's every word, ready to react immediately. I have no doubt that if Callan had so wished, or if those soldiers had attempted to harm her, none of them would have left that park alive. Lelouch leaned back and let the words sit. For her part, Millie looked shaken. It hurt Lelouch to see his normally vivacious friend in such a state, no doubt suddenly worried and acutely aware of her own mortality. Nunnally, however, merely seemed thoughtful. Enlightening as this is, none of it means that Lady Stadtfeld is partially Japanese by birth. After all, much of your evidence could describe us equally well, as far as our official records and our familiarities with the local tongue go, Nunnally pointed out, and just because she has earned the loyalty of the locals does not make her a native. True, Lelouch conceded, and I will admit that she certainly doesn't look Japanese, not even a jot. At this point, however, I would argue that the distinction is irrelevant. Whatever the case, Callan is tightly bound to a group willing to open fire on a group of obvious soldiers if they posed a threat to her. That's not the kind of loyalty or dedication that just comes from an ordinary charity, and certainly not the kind of loyalty a teenage noble can earn in a few months. If she is the one truly responsible for creating this organization, one that just so happened to employ dedicated Japanese, instead of honorary Britannians who could easily become indebted to her. Nunnally hummed thoughtfully as she trailed off, tapping her chair with her free hand as she considered the possibilities. I still say Callan has a good heart, but I do understand the reasons for your concern, big brother. So, to conclude, Lelouch said, Callan has somehow acquired the loyalty of a group of Japanese insurgents, a loyalty that is reciprocated, probably due to her mixed blood. Despite her obviously shaky loyalty to the Empire, the Peelers have been convinced through some unknown method to look the other way on her. Indiscretions. This already made her a very dangerous person before our very own Major Pitt revealed her to be a natural ace nightmare pilot. She is also very clearly a deeply angry person. I trust, Lelouch said, looking around the room, that you understand my concerns. Well, maybe she can be talked around? Millie's tone betrayed her desperation. I mean, if she's got people she's close with, maybe. Maybe she isn't out for revenge? I mean, surely she's got better targets than a school crammed with the children of the moneyed elite profiting off her people's suffering? Lelouch finished for her. No, Millie. I remember that day, that month. I remember. The smoke filled the sky, entire cities turned into mass funeral pyres, carrying the souls of murdered millions up to their impotent goddess. The feral dogs yelping and burrowing into the rubble, slat-sided with hunger. The stench of decay wafted up from those holes into the unquiet tombs of the dead, homes smashed down by distant cruel hands onto entire families, wiping out lineages in moments. She will want her revenge, Lelouch continued, speaking just as much to explain the danger to Millie as to keep his throat open, his tongue moving, his mind distracted from memories now 6 years old. However kind her heart may be, the ruin Britannia has likely brought to her has certainly given her ample cause to hate the Empire with all her soul. Considering the damage the Empire has inflicted, can you blame her for such anger? Big brother, Nunnally said, an unbearably sad look on her face as she took his hand in both of hers. You don't know that. You are merely speculating. Not everyone is out for revenge, some people just want to help a noble cause. In this instance, dear sister, I worry that the difference between those two is not so clear-cut, Lelouch replied with a heavy heart. Even if Callan were a saint, it is not as if Britannia has not provided her with a bounty of sinners against which she can direct her righteous anger. Including me, Millie muttered in a hollow voice. This whole time, I've just been convincing her to hate me, haven't I? I would not put it quite like that, but... Lelouch grimaced. It was difficult to deny the obvious. But what else can I say? Millie snarled. If Callan is Japanese, then everything I've been doing to be nice has done nothing but make me the face of everything she probably hates about us. We don't know that. Lelouch hastily pointed out, briefly wondering how he had become the one arguing against pessimistic paranoia. All my evidence is circumstantial at best. I'll admit, it could be a problem, but she said it herself, Millie cried. She hates me for being a puppet master. Because Millie cut herself off with a choked sob. Nunnally was right, I never asked what she wanted. I never really thought about who Callan was or what her heart was like. I just forced myself on her, like Britannia forced itself on her life. When she was about to go up onto that stage today, I said she was growing into a splendid young Britannian flower. Lelouch. Millie looked up, eyes haunted by the realization. If she's the ticking time bomb you think she is, I'm the one who's been winding her up. Lelouch found his victory over Millie utterly cold, the taste sickening in his mouth. Well, I must say that Callan seems to have a commendable reservoir of self-control, Nunnally commented half a minute later, making a valiant attempt to break the silence and force the conversation back on track. Callan, excuse me, Lady Stadtfeld, That is truly impressive. It will take a meaningful apology to make this right. Well, I suppose that is the next topic, regardless of what Callan is actually up to outside of school grounds, Lelouch replied, pulling out a chair and taking a seat next to his sister at the table. I do not believe that a simple sorry is going to be enough here. We need to offer Callan something of value to both make things right, and to avoid any lapse in control. It's probably best if I'm not the one to deliver that apology, Millie said gloomily. I don't think she'd take it well. Lelouch? I would be happy to help you out, Madam President, he replied, earning a pleased smile from Nunnally. I can deliver that apology when I welcome her onto the student council. It would probably be best if that welcome were a one-on-one affair. Lady Stadtfeld does not strike me as a party person. Certainly not a fan of surprise parties, above all else. Yes, probably for the best, Millie agreed, an admission that must have hurt coming from the party queen herself. So, what do you get for a noble lady who hates her country? For a moment, Lelouch entertained the idea of giving an honest answer. Between the Ashfords' assets, their own checkered history with the throne, and their ex-noble status, he supposed something could be arranged. After all, the Ashford patriarch had already committed sedition when he had kept the Britannias hidden, instead of handing them back over to that man. Of course, that's a rather simplistic way of evaluating the matter. Aiding a pair of disinherited royals is a far cry from providing material support to a number rebellion. If I might make a suggestion, Nunnally chimed in, she would almost certainly appreciate some help with her records, as well as a copy of our current file for her own perusal. Especially since Big Brother was easily able to find some discrepancies. It would demonstrate a willingness to help her secrets stay just that, secret. That would be easy to accomplish, Lelouch added, with Millie nodding in agreement. Honestly, I could probably go even further with the same idea. If the night police have already been told not to investigate the contents of her folder, I doubt anybody would pay much attention to some subtle editing of the contents. After all, there is really no reason for our earnest protectors to know when a young lady chooses to visit her family, is there? None at all, Big Brother, Nunnally agreed with an angelic smile. Indeed, I feel like those gentlemen were quite crass in their observation of Lady Stadtfeld. Do you think you could help them make amends for their indiscretions? That could be a bit more difficult, Lelouch admitted, rubbing his chin, but on the other hand, the Peelers have never been the best at information security. I happened to hear that Callan's Pet Benevolent Association was experiencing some money problems. Do you think a donation would be adequate amends, dear sister? Oh? Just happened to hear that, did you? Millie smirked from her end of the table. You certainly were very thorough in your investigations, weren't you, Lulu? You really probed Callan's background very deeply. Lelouch ignored Millie's harmless provocations and stood up from the table. And on that note, I believe we have a plan. Millie, you owe me for this. Sure. The languid mask of the Queen Bee of Ashford was well and truly back in place. You know I'm always happy to do anything that might make you happy, Lelouch. Except, of course, for your own share of the council's paperwork, Nunnally interjected helpfully. Really, Millie, it is quite rude how much of Big Brother's time you take up. I need some Lelouch time as well. And Sayoko is ever so sad when he stays out late, slaving over the budget. Hey, that's not because of me. Millie protested with faux indignation. You should check some smoky den of gamblers and thieves if you really want to make Sayoko happy by having him back by curfew. Being the master of strategy that he was, Lelouch knew instantly that there was no way to fend off the combined teasing efforts of his sister and his hostess. I will get started on our conciliatory gift to Callan, he said, retreating from the conference room. Plenty of work to be done, after all. A good day to you both, Madam President, Madam Junior President. Nunnally's peals of delighted laughter followed him out into the hallway as the door swung shut, and Lelouch smiled at the sound as he began trudging his way back up to the apartment. He sincerely hoped that Callan would enjoy the gift and take it in the spirit intended, burying the hatchet. He quite liked Millie and enjoyed how Nunnally came alive around her. It would be a shame if it became necessary to prevent Callan from disturbing that happiness. May 6, 2016 ATB, Ashford Academy, Tokyo Settlement. 1240. The view from the roof of Ashford Academy was, as always, distinctly lacking, in Lelouch's opinion. The trendier neighborhoods of the Tokyo settlement, home to the upper crust of the commons and the lower orders of the nobility, stretched out to the east towards the looming edifice of the Britannian concession squatting atop its gargantuan platform. Looking out from the roof of the science wing, a casual viewer could believe themselves back in the homeland. Britannia, as far as the eye can see. So much progress yet so little taste. So much construction, yet utterly devoid of anything that could be called architecture. It would almost be farcical if it were not for all the bones beneath the foundations of those shining halls, not to mention the jagged spires of broken Tokyo, still rusting in place, 6 years after the old city's murder. To the north, the prosperous neighborhoods extended a bit further before gradually tapering off into the more working-class neighborhoods and finally out into the honorary Britannian districts. Barely visible over the hodgepodge of 2 to 4-story structures, residential and industrial and commercial all jumbled up, the walls of the Shinjuku ghetto cowered against the horizon, peeping out towards the concession like a dog afraid of being beaten. How ironic that the walls of the ghetto were raised by those caged within. The same hands that laid down the piling for the stilts also poured the concrete slabs that were raised around their refugee camp turned open-air prison. Lelouch often came up to the roof to think. He had always had an affinity for high places, even back in childhood, when he had scrambled onto the Widow's Walk atop the Ares Palace to survey the grounds. He had watched the chain gangs of newly christened 11s raise the walls around Shinjuku 5 years ago, standing on the roof of the expropriated home purchased by Reuben Ashford as his temporary residence. He had wondered then if one of the tiny figures toiling away was Suzaku, beaten and forced into submission. I had half hoped that would be the case, for it would have meant that he was still alive. I suppose in a way that hope has been fulfilled. I suppose there is a lesson in that, if I squint hard enough to see it. 4 days ago, Lelouch had seen his best friend again for the first time in years. It had not been the reunion he had dreamt of, although Suzaku was Nunnally's friend as well. Lelouch had yet to tell her that he had seen the other boy alive and, well, he supposed. At the very least, Lelouch thought, leaning on the railing guarding the roof's edge, I saw that he was alive. I am not sure if I can describe the man I saw menace supposedly unarmed civilians mentally well. Suzaku. What happened to you? That was the question indeed. What had happened to Suzaku, after Lelouch had bid him return to his father? 3 weeks after Suzaku had promised eternal friendship and left, the Britannians had broadcast the news of Prime Minister Kurorugi's suicide, helicopters flying overhead dropping leaflets as radios boomed the announcement out on all frequencies. For his part, Lelouch had doubted that the Kurorugi patriarch had ordered a general surrender before taking his life. That did not mesh with the man who had been his reluctant host for a year. Lelouch had found it far more likely that man had ordered the assassination of Kurorugi Jinbu and had falsely claimed the surrender, destroying Japanese leadership and morale in a single fell swoop. At the time, he could only assume that Suzaku had joined his father in the grave. But that was clearly not the case, because Corporal Kurorugi was unquestionably Suzaku. But, while the Suzaku Lelouch had known was a pig-headed, violent pain in the ass, obsessed with honor and rules, he was also a kind boy who had endless patience for Nunnally, who always strove to be the best, and who had eagerly joined a young exiled prince in petty childhood mischiefs, such as filling Todo's gi with itching powder. I can still see the edges of that boy in the soldier he has become if I squint hard enough. Behind Lelouch, the door to the rooftop opened and the reason why he was up on the roof thinking about Suzaku stepped out, eyes wary and stiff in her new uniform. So, Kallen Stadtfeld said, her level tone conveying a calm professionalism that almost successfully hid her simmering anger from Lelouch's educated ears. If Millie put you up to this, please just tell me right now. You can consider your job completed and message delivered, and I'll have enough time to enjoy my sandwich in peace. Congratulations on your ceremony, Cadet Sergeant Stadtfeld, Lelouch replied in lieu of an answer, turning from the railing to face his classmate. I do not believe that it is precisely common for cadets to be promoted 2 grades before their first day of training, not even for noble cadets. That is quite the accomplishment indeed. Thanks, she replied curtly, I'm honored. Was that all? Not quite, Lelouch said as Kallen half turned back towards the door. As the highest-ranking cadet enrolled at Ashford, you were also the first leader of the newly founded Ashford ROTC. Has Major Pitt already gone over your responsibilities? Not yet, Kallen admitted, her lips twisting with momentary distaste. I have a meeting scheduled with him after school, though, so maybe that's when he'll tell me what exactly being a cadet sergeant entails. I would have appreciated the warning and maybe an explanation. You and me both, Stadtfeld. Although at least Millie doesn't demand that I salute when she gives orders. Not usually, anyway. Sprung it on you, did he? Lelouch asked sympathetically. Well, I cannot claim much insight into the ROTC, not exactly being a military man myself. He smirked at his own self-depreciation, but I did want to let you know that, as the leader of the ROTC, you have a seat on the student council. Momentary surprise flashed to annoyance. What? Fuck, of course I do, she muttered, clearly irritated. Damn it. Seriously, is there anything at this damned school that Millie doesn't somehow control? Funny you should mention that, Cadet Sergeant. Lelouch couldn't help but smirk at the irony of her comment. The ROTC is at the academy by decree of Prince Clovis, and such it is well outside the purview of what the Ashfords can command. Lelouch's smile turned apologetic as he continued. Much as you may believe otherwise, your addition to the council as the voice of the ROTC is not one of our machinations. In fact, you can thank your new commanding officer for this particular obligation. He was quite insistent that the ROTC should have the opportunity to speak for the most patriotic students enrolled at Ashford Academy. Which, I suppose, means you. Callan drew herself up, and for a moment Lelouch worried that she was about to do something unwise, but instead, she released her mounting frustration in a controlled huff halfway between a sigh and a growl. I see, Callan carefully enunciated through grit teeth. She forced a smile at him, boiling rage locked tight behind a brutally thin mask of gratitude. Thank you for the information, Lelouch. It seems we shall be colleagues soon enough. How did Millie fail to notice her anger? Lelouch marveled. To him, Callan's attempts to conceal her feelings behind smiles and small talk were decidedly wooden and transparent to the point of obviousness. Perhaps she is still shaken from the ceremony? It would be understandable if my deductions about her political loyalties are anything close to accurate. Indeed. So, welcome to the student committee, Cadet Sergeant Stadtfeld, Lelouch said with a smile full of sympathy. Actually, do you mind if I call you Callan? The title is frankly a bit much. Callan's brow furrowed, her mask strained yet further by the naked suspicion dancing in her eyes. Lelouch could practically feel the brush of her scalpel-like glare against his skin as she scanned him up and down, searching for hidden motives and potential threats. Oh, Millie, Lelouch chided internally, you had no idea of just how dangerous the beast you were prodding this whole time was, did you? Sure, Callan eventually allowed, sliding back into the mask of the casual noble cadet with effort. It's just a stuffy rank, anyways, don't worry about it. She shrugged. Besides, we're gonna be working together soon enough anyways, aren't we? Standing on ceremony sounds like it'd just get in the way. True enough, Callan, said Lelouch, and that brings me to another matter. While I was getting your council membership paperwork organized, you get a small, discretionary salary as a sitting member. By the way, I happened to come across a few small irregularities in your academy records. Callan's breath stilled, the potent energy that had swirled around her since she had stepped through the door abruptly focused entirely on Lelouch. The sudden air of menace was almost palpable. And without even lifting a finger. Quite impressive, really. And what, Callan asked, her voice very careful, very contained, irregularities did you find, Mr. Vice President? Lelouch, please, he replied with a casual smile. It would be best, I think, to humanize myself in her eyes as quickly as possible. And to let her know that people know where I am. Do not worry overly much, Callan, Lelouch continued. I even asked my little sister if she thought there would be any issues from the minor clerical errors I spotted before I took her to her classes this morning. She assured me that all would be well. How reassuring. The noble cadet and secret dissident looked anything but reassured. Her face had all the mobility and warmth of porcelain, and Lelouch noticed that her fists were tightly balled at the sides of her uniform's grey skirt. The vibrant red hair under her garrison cap practically screamed warnings to his animal brain to stay away and not to touch under any circumstances. She looks just like Cornelia, only slightly less headstrong. Well, I am sure you will be happy to hear that all of those clerical errors have been addressed, Lelouch blithely continued, pretending that he hadn't noticed how her eyes had fixated on his throat. None other than yours truly corrected your record at the academy. I took the liberty of running off a complete copy of your new, accurate school record for you to peruse. Taking a very small gamble, they were still on school grounds, after all, and he doubted she would murder him in the middle of the lunch hour. Lelouch turned his back on the simmering girl and stepped over to the valise he had left leaning against the rail. As he reached down, he slowed and carefully twisted just enough so Callan could watch him reach into the satchel and withdraw a folder. "Here we go," Lelouch said cheerfully as he returned, deliberately not noticing how one of her hands was slowly creeping back into sight from behind her back. One copy of the Academy records of Callan Stadtfeld. Now with corrected information regarding your middle school attendance, your mother's marriage date to your father, and also with updated medical records to reflect your problems earlier this year. Callan's eyes narrowed as she accepted the folder from him, and she barely looked down as she flipped the folder open. So, now she knows that I know that her records are fabricated. She also knows that I have gone out of my way to cover for her. I think her reaction will be suspicion. "That was very kind of you, Lelouch," Callan replied, her voice notably less than gracious. "Although, I can't help but think that there could be some problems in the future when someone contrasts my academy file with the Ministry of Education's files. Also, while I'm not questioning your word, if the Academy's files are so easy to mess with, how can I be sure that someone with enough access like, say, the council president wouldn't be able to screw with them again?" "By wondrous design," Lelouch said breezily, "the ministry's records were recently updated to reflect data corrections submitted by some of Japan's, Area 11's educational facilities. As for future interference, well..." He grimaced slightly. "Look, to be forthright about this, Millie unquestionably acted dishonorably towards you. Multiple times. But, she wants to make this right. Whose access code do you think I used when I edited your files? When she forgets to pretend to be a noble," Lelouch mused as Callan's eyes flew wide at his accidental slip of the tongue, before narrowing in anger at her tormentor's name. "She has an amazingly expressive face. She would have been devoured alive by the court in an afternoon. Figuratively speaking, of course. Probably. If I don't accept this apology," Callan ground out. "What then? Will Madam President somehow arrange for me to fail a test? Contrive to force me into some humiliating and revealing costume? Put me up for grabs again? Oh, Millie." Lelouch almost sighed, "You really did a number on this girl. All in the name of fun. I hope you've learned your lesson. If you do not accept her apology, it will simply create an awkward work environment," Lelouch replied calmly, carefully pitching his voice towards honest openness. "I understand that Millie is difficult at the best of times, truly, I do. But, and I say this as the other person she put up for grabs recently, she truly is not a bad person. Spoiled? Yes. Thoughtless? Often. Oversexed and bored? Always. But you will be on the student council with her, Callan, unless you can convince Major Pitt otherwise. I wonder if the army would just let me transfer schools?" Callan thought aloud. "I know most of the other schools here in Area 11 suck, but I think Major Pitt would allow a great deal," Lelouch carefully answered. "But, tell me, Callan, do you think a man like that would do you any favor for free? Do I have any reason to believe this apology from Millie is anything other than a noose around my neck and a pat on the head?" Callan shot back. "My father sent me to this academy in part to avoid the military meddling with his house. But that plan's dead and gone, thanks to Millie's kind assistance, so..." Callan's smile was anything but nice. "So, what do I have to lose?" "That," Lelouch began, carefully recalculating, "is a fair point, and I can see why you might see things that way. But I do not think sitting on the student council will be quite as bad as you expect. Rivals will be there, for one, as will I. Millie did not understand before quite how she was affecting you, but she has been made to see the error in her ways. Before you consider transferring, kindly give us a shot. You might even enjoy yourself." "Why are you giving me the hard sell here?" Callan asked as the pendulum swung back to suspicion. "What's in it for you, Lelouch? Why are you so eager for me to join your council?" I doubt she would respond well to my reasoning, namely Knights of the Round grade pilots don't just fall from the sky, and I plan on making you my tool. Because I think that you and I combined can effectively check most of Millie's more outrageous ideas, Lelouch responded instead. Rivals is quite impressed by you, impressed enough that he might resist Millie's charms if you ask him for your support. Between my role as vice president and his role as treasurer of the student council, the three of us should be able to put the kibosh on most of her inane impulses. Just imagine it, an Ashford Academy without weekly parties. Lelouch had hoped that the remark would help open a chink in her armor. Humor was, after all, an invaluable diplomatic weapon, when wielded correctly. Instead, Callan gave him a long, slow blink. Well, it might be time for Plan C, Lelouch thought, sure she was about to refuse. But then she surprised him. All right, fine, whatever, Callan sighed. I'll attend a few meetings. But if that bitch tries to grab my chest even once, I am going to smash her perfect fucking teeth out of her stupid fucking face, understand? Clearly, Callan wasn't entirely sold by his pitch, but that she was still willing to play ball at all meant Lelouch wasn't out of the game quite yet. And if I have an inch, I'll take a mile. Like crystal, Lelouch replied with a smile of his own, stretching out a hand. Welcome to the student council, Callan. Together, we shall do great things. And if I can truly bring you into my confidence, perhaps a noble Britannian junior officer with sympathies for the Japanese can do what I cannot. I would not have survived without Suzaku's help, I am sure of that. I cannot repay the favor to save him from his own bad decisions now, but to a rising young ace, many doors are open. I have not forgotten the fields of the dead, and I remember who brought food and water for Nunnally. Hold on, Suzaku, I was strong enough to carry Nunnally then, and soon I will be strong enough to carry you. May 6, 2016 ATB, Alleyway, Kita Ward, Tokyo Settlement. 1758. Long ago and far away, Alexander Le Britannia, the 8th prince and one of Lelouch's 10 elder half-brothers, had scoffed at a then 7-year-old Lelouch's claims of possessing a genius to rival their elder half-brother, Prince Schniezels. Alexander, a thin bespectacled boy, had been very bookish, and just as Schniesel favored chess as his intellectual battleground, Alexander had favored the memorization and recitation of long books. If you're so smart, Alexander had challenged, memorize the entirety of the Holy Bible. Schniesel did as much when he was 10, and if you really are smarter than him, you should be able to do the same at 7. For the next 3 days, Lelouch had spent every free minute committing the old tome to his memory, preparing to defend his clearly obvious genius against his petulant elder half-brother. As it turned out, he need not have bothered. Alexander was found dead in his bedroom 4 days later, the skin around his mouth red and blistered. The very next day, 9 servants and a guard had been proclaimed guilty of regicide and flayed for poisoning the 8th prince. Emperor Charles, of course, hadn't attended either the mass flaying or Alexander's funeral. But Lelouch still had that book pressed into his memory. He'd had little reason to summon up his knowledge of the King James's text in the last 9 years, but it was still there, squatting toad-like in the back of his head. All right, something about fish and the number 18. Mark 1:17 is the bit about fishers of men, and Mark 1:18 is. And straightway they forsook their nets, and followed him. Which tells me nothing, but maybe the arrow was pointing past the puzzle? Lelouch, back in the same working-class neighborhood he'd wandered into on Monday night, ventured deeper into the alley, walking past the cross half hidden behind the dumpster as he looked for further paint in either the silver or the blue shades left near the entrance. At an intersection with the larger alley, a smudge of powder blue in a vaguely arrow-like shape pointed Lelouch northwards. 2 intersections down, a vague blob on a sewer grate gestured to the east. Lelouch, already tired of the game, pushed on regardless. He devoted enough time to this nonsense that the pressure of the sunk cost fallacy overmatched his mounting irritation. Finally, after what felt like an endless series of hints that presumably would have been barely noticeable to someone without his observational skills and genius, Lelouch reached the end of his impromptu hash run in front of a set of stairs descending to the basement access. Checking his phone, Lelouch found that it was almost 1900 already, and the streets were thronged with pedestrians. I will have to come back again later, perhaps after nightfall, he decided. There are simply too many people around. But that puzzle must be some sort of password or code, something to get in. When would they most likely meet, though? Sunday? That would be the most obvious day for a secret group of heretics or schismatics to meet. Lelouch stepped back from the stairs and looked at the building the basement was under. Albert's Tap House, eh? So a bar. It sounds like it's pretty busy in there. Makes sense for a Friday night. He walked up to the bar's entrance and peered at the paper menu taped to the inside of the window door. Next to the daily specials was a list of weekly events. Ladies' night every Saturday from 1600 until 2100? No, that doesn't feel right. But bar trivia at 2000 every Tuesday night, huh? Sounds like a bunch of traffic coming in and out. Good cover for any individual or group of any age. Perfect for an illicit basement meeting. Well, Lelouch smiled to himself, I do enjoy a round of trivia now and again. I would just have to make sure that I avoid winning by too much. Actually, he frowned, I probably should not win, that would make me memorable. That's the last thing I want, and assuming that the group meeting in the basement has any organization, there will be someone watching the crowd, looking for police plants. Which, he mused as he turned and started making his way back down the street, means that I should not come by myself either, as a single outsider could strike paranoid heretics as suspicious. Rivals is probably out as well, as two strange young men are probably just as suspicious as one alone. But Millie, maybe? A young couple using a casual social event to facilitate a date? Now that has legs. Besides, she does owe me for cleaning up her mess with Callan. I'm sure she'll be happy to wipe the slate clean so quickly. Millie picked up on the second ring. Hey there, Lulu, the Ashford heiress said by way of greeting, her voice sultry even over the phone's tinny speakers, making a nighttime call to little Olmi? How intriguing. I hope you aren't calling me with honorable intentions? I am afraid that I will have to disappoint you, Lelouch chuckled, walking as he talked into the phone. After all, when are my intentions ever anything less than honorable? That's the disappointing part, Millie sighed. You know, you really could stand to be a bit more adventurous, Lulu. Just a bit. Lelouch ignored the flare of annoyance with practiced ease, a swift rebuttal already on his lips. I need to be more adventurous, Remind me, Millie, which one of us actually dares venture outside the campus to find their fun? He could practically hear her pout from the other end of the line. Lelouch didn't even bother to trying to hide the smile it brought to his lips. In fact, it was just the other day you were chiding me for braving the Black King's gambling halls while you sat around a boudoir, was it not? Fiend. Millie whined into his ear, you made your point, Lulu. Forgive a delicate maiden such as myself for wanting to have a little fun with the Academy's very own tall, dark and charming bachelor. If I'd known you'd be so black-hearted as to spurn such a beautiful flower's advances as well as Shirley's, maybe I shouldn't have bothered. Well, Lelouch said aloud, ask and you shall receive, Millie. I have a sojourn to the Keter Ward planned for next Tuesday, an adventure, if you will. Would you care to be my +1? Oh my, so forward. Millie all but purred in his ear. You'd take an almost noble girl like me out to such a rough and tumble place? What villainy do you have in mind? Something that would scandalize Shirley, I hope. Did you find a new dive to play cards in? Or perhaps it's a cockfighting ring this time? Neither. Millie Ashford. Lelouch grinned into the phone, injecting as much unwarranted seriousness into the invitation as he could. Would you do me the honor of joining me for a night of bar trivia? You cannot be serious. The disappointment in her sigh was bottomless, and Lelouch's grin grew an inch wider. Bar trivia? Seriously, Lulu? Why the hell are you going to bar trivia? We can discuss it further in person if you wish, he said, allowing the smile and silliness to slip away in favor of a more somber tone. But just to keep things short, I want a good look at the inside of the basement of the bar in question. A young couple out for some school night fun seems less obviously suspicious than a lone man skulking around. Oh? Predictably, the flirtatiousness returned to Millie's voice. We'd be posing as a couple? Well, just so long as you know what you're getting into, Lulu. The great Millie Ashford is a method actress, you know Tilda. I never kiss on a first date, Lelouch replied blandly. Who said it had to be our first, Tilda? Millie purred in his ear. I certainly don't intend for it to be our last, Tilda. Lelouch sighed tiredly. Thanks, Millie, I appreciate it. It's always a pleasure, she said warmly, even if you are a tease. My, Shirley's going to be jealous, Tilda. Somehow, I doubt I will lose much sleep over it, Lelouch replied. The comment, intended as a casual dismissal, reminded him of a topic he had already been losing sleep over. Hey, Millie? What is it, Lelouch? Millie had clearly noticed the change in his voice, her own growing equally serious. Do you? He gulped. Do you or your grandfather have any connections in the military? Millie hesitated. You'll have to be more specific than that. Why? What do you need? I have a friend, Lelouch began, a friend from before. Before the conquest. Before I accepted the hospitality of the House of Ashford. A Japanese friend. Recently, I discovered that he has, for some baffling reason, taken up the oath in one of the honorary legions. Oh, Lulu. Millie's voice was instantly sympathetic and pitying. I'm so sorry. But, I mean, chances are that he'll survive his stint. And 10 years isn't too long. By the time it's up, things might have simmered down a bit. Good to know that we both suck at being reassuring. I am not content to take chances, not when I can avoid it, Lelouch replied dispassionately, pushing the instantaneous throb that the thought of losing another important person inspired back down. However, I have limited means and no inroads into the military. On the other hand, the Ashford name still carries weight, at least in regards to nightmare-related matters. Do you think that there could be any possibility that? I mean, Millie sounded uneasy. I guess there's always a chance? Grandpa has a pretty deep favor bank, so. Possibly? But. Come on, Lulu, they're not going to let an honorary, especially not an 11 honorary, anywhere near a nightmare. Just. Try, he requested, hating the waver that entered his voice. Please. It does not have to be with the Nightmare Corps. I would just be happy with his transfer to a unit not comprised solely of expendable cannon fodder. While I am confident that my friend will survive his term of service even in the Honorary Legion, I doubt that he will still be the person I remember by the end of it. I can't promise anything, but I'll try, Millie agreed, sympathy warring with reluctance. What's this friend's name? Do you know what his unit and rank are? I should have looked up the unit. It would not have been difficult to find his service record. But I just could not bring myself to look for it. I did not want to know what he had done in that man's name. His family name is Kurorugi, Lelouch said gratefully, and his given name is Suzaku. I think I heard one of the soldiers I saw refer to him as Corporal. I do not know his unit, they were out of uniform when I saw them. Kurorugi, eh? Clearly, the name was not lost on Millie. And a corporal? Man, the Legion has no idea who he is, do they? That's good, that'll help. I'll see what I can do. Thank you, Lelouch replied, and ended the call. I have done what I can for Suzaku for now, and I have already spent my favor with Millie. I hope her grandfather can do something to save him because I surely cannot. May 10, 2016 ATB, Albert's Tap House, Kita Ward, Tokyo Settlement. 1948. By the time Millie and Lelouch arrived at the tap house, an impressive crowd had already gathered at the bar. The common area was practically standing room only, and the shared table the middle-aged waitress guided Millie towards only had a single seat available. Lelouch graciously pulled it out for his date, before leaning against the wall behind her. New faces, eh? A matronly woman greeted them with a tired yet cheerful from across the table. Good to meet you, dearies. I'm Hilda. And this is my husband, Charles. Here for some trivia, eh? A slender man with the shiny burns and thick calluses of a machinist waved from Hilda's right. What are you kids good for, I'm pretty good at football trivia myself, and the missus knows everything there is to know about the soaps and shows. It's good to meet you guys too. Millie beamed. I'm Millie, and this is Leland. I'm pretty good at botany, biology, and all kinds of anatomy. Oh, and I watch a ton of TV too, so I can help you out, Hilda. And I have a pretty solid command of history, Lelouch put in, leaning forwards onto the back of Millie's chair and resting his hands on her shoulders. We cover each other's weaknesses quite nicely. I am certain that tonight, we shall triumph. Quite right. The wire-thin man across Charles put in, bright eyes blazing under a manic shock of hair as he turned to greet the newcomers. The name's Havelock. And if you want any poetry or literary trivia, I'm your man. Do you guys have a team name or anything? Millie asked as Lelouch waved down a waitress. And who's asking the questions tonight, do you know? Your first time? Hilda asked with a knowing chuckle. Not to worry, dearies, we're always looking for fresh blood. Old Tim always asks the questions, and we don't do team names. Each of the tables is numbered, so we just go those instead. Didn't always used to be that way, Havelock interjected. Used to be that everybody would spend a good 15-20 minutes hashing out the names. But, as always, some young prick got all pissy about it and tried to glass his buddy when they just couldn't agree, so the table number is the house rule now. My, how violent, Millie gasped theatrically behind her hand, miming a worried glance up at Lelouch. Familiarity made the dancing sparks of interest in her eye impossible to miss. Glassing. That's when someone breaks a bottle and slashes someone with it, right? What happened? Was he okay? Nothing like a bit of danger to inject a note of adventure, Lelouch thought wryly. And Millie certainly loves her adventures. MHM. Charles nodded, lips tightening momentarily. Smashed a pint glass over the poor devil's head. Damned mess to clean up. But the peelers showed up soon enough to haul the bastard away, and Doc Lawn got the glass out of the other man's scalp. Damn eventful for a Tuesday night, I tell you. Quite, Lelouch replied as the order of fried onions arrived. Here, help yourselves, everybody. Thank you for letting Millie and I join you for the night. Thanks, Leland. Havelock didn't wait for any further invitation, and as a second platter of fried onions and a round of cheap beer for the adults and cokes for the two 16-year-olds arrived, the small talk turned increasingly amiable. By the time old Tim stepped up to the ancient microphone to start the trivia night in earnest, Millie already had all three of the locals eating out of her palm, to Lelouch's amusement. She had dressed them both up as commoners for the night with an efficiency and a deft touch that he should have expected in hindsight, considering her love of costumes. Interestingly, away from Ashford Academy and everybody who knew her as Millie Ashford apart from himself, Millie had chosen a very demure outfit, contrary to Lelouch's expectations. Her long skirt was loose and reached all the way down to the middle of her calves, and the shawl draped over her blouse covered up any stray hint of skin. Not that there were any, as she had buttoned said blouse all the way to the neckline. Honestly, I think the modest outfit would shock our classmates more than the Queen of Ashford lowering herself to a blue-collar bar. Disguises aside, it was surprisingly easy for Lelouch to allow himself to slip into Leland, the pleasant and polite student and amateur historian. The role felt light on his shoulders and it gave him a reason to feign ignorance about most of the questions asked. By forcing himself to only give input on questions relating to history, Lelouch was proud that his team was in second place by the end of the round, narrowly avoiding the first place slot. The only downside was how persistent Millie was in sticking to her self-assigned role as his girlfriend. When someone at another table had left, Havelock had managed to snag their chair and had offered it to Lelouch so he could sit down. No sooner had he taken his seat than Millie had hopped up from her chair and deposited herself in his lap, to the men's approving laughter and Hilda's tolerant smile. Before Lelouch could protest, Havelock had slid the now vacant chair back over to the other table, leaving him with a lap full of smiling student council president. Then came the long, soulful stares when old Tim had asked about some soap opera relationship, which character had left his wife for his mistress or some rot. Then had come her fanciful nonsense when Hilda had asked how they had met. Apparently, Leland and Millie were childhood friends who had been briefly separated by a parental move before they had reunited in Area 11, a triumph of young love, to hear Millie tell it. Hilda had been properly appreciative, cooing in all the right spots. Lelouch had been less enthusiastic, although he had managed to play his irritation off as coy shyness. To his mild horror, Havelock had been very sympathetic when Millie had hopped off to use the ladies' room. "Enjoy it while it lasts, lad," he'd advised, clapping Leland on the shoulder with surprising strength for such a thin man. "Birds come and they go, and scarcely do they linger on a branch for long. Just don't let that one tie you up in too many knots, okay? Sometimes," he winked, "they like to be chased, you know. Just so long as it's on their terms." Thankfully, before Lelouch had been forced to try to respond to that, Hilda had ridden to his rescue. "Havelock Smythe, you horrible man, what nonsense are you putting in that boy's brain?" Her spoon had smacked down into the table beside Havelock's hand, causing the man to jump in his chair. Damned poets. Fortunately, by the time the third round had begun, Lelouch had managed to escape into a second chair, freeing himself temporarily from Millie's admittedly convincing acting. That acting served as an excellent smokescreen, allowing Leland to steadily retreat away from the conversation as Millie chatted on. By the time they secured third place, in no small part thanks to Lelouch's iron self-control stopping him from providing all of the answers to his teammates, Millie was deep into a conversation with Hilda about some convoluted television plot Lelouch couldn't even begin to make out. Meanwhile, Charles and Havelock were bitching about some unknown party. Seizing his chance, Lelouch muttered something about paying for the appetizers and slipped away from the table, leaving Millie to hold all attention firmly in place. The bartender was, to say the least, unwelcoming. "What do you want, kid?" His accent was pure Pendragon, revealing the man's homeland heritage. "You here to settle?" "Yes, sir," Lelouch smiled as he fished a few pound coins out of his pocket. The onions were quite good. "Good to hear it," the bartender muttered as he pushed a grubby note across the stained wooden surface of the bar. 3 and 10, please." "Here you go." Lelouch dropped 5 of the worn coins onto the receipt and pushed the paper back across the counter. "I was kind of disappointed that you did not have any calamari available, though. I guess the fishermen forsook their nets for the night, eh? They must have followed some loudmouth off to other engagements." The bartender frowned for a moment, presumably wondering what Lelouch was on about since calamari rings were very clearly listed on the appetizers. Then, his expression went blank again, as placid as a lake. "Could be the case. You know how it is. Someone sees some sign and decides to upend their whole life over it. They get it in their head to go out and conquer the world." As the bartender spoke, he wrung out a wet rag on the bar in front of Lelouch. Without breaking eye contact, Lelouch drew a very sloppy Cairo with the water droplets, before the rag swished back and wiped away the symbol. "Past the bathrooms and down the stairs," the bartender said in a conversational tone, a non sequitur to anybody not in the know. "Mind your head, there's a bump halfway down." "Many thanks." Lelouch tapped a finger to his forehead as if miming a salute, before letting his fingers drop straight down to brush over his lips. The bartender mimed touching his heart and nodded, and Lelouch walked past him into the dimly lit back corridor. The hallway was thankfully deserted and Lelouch quickly found the splintered wooden door marked stairs just past the restrooms, tucked away behind a pile of empty crates. The only sign that anybody had slipped past the crates in recent memory was the lack of grime where the opening door had pushed it back. Without so much as a single backward look, Lelouch stepped around the accumulated crates, turned the knob, and quietly slipped past the door into the darkness beyond. Confidence is the key. The most crucial part of any disguise was the confidence that you were who you claimed to be. It had been that way everywhere Lelouch had gone in life, from the imperial court to the shattered post-conquest streets of Hakioji. And now, by sign and by signal, I have told whoever is down in the basement that I am one of them. Therefore, I am coming home, not plunging into danger. Confidence. Halfway down the stairs, Lelouch was forced to duck under a low-hanging HVAC conduit. "Just like the barman warned me about," he thought with amusement, rubbing at his aching forehead, although not quite the way I had expected. With all of those double meanings we were tossing around, I expected the bump I should watch for would be a man with a baton. I suppose that was not, in fact, part of the skullduggery. The basement Lelouch stepped out into was built of dingy red bricks and had clearly seen long service as the storage room for the bar's excess inventory before it had found a new purpose. His eyes darted from the 20-odd people standing around the basement clearly waiting for someone to show up to the obvious altar standing at the head of the room, if such a term could be used to describe a pair of boards on top of a keg draped in a tablecloth. Above the altar, an old banner hung from a nail driven into the brickwork. The white linen had yellowed with age, but the embroidered device still retained its original colors of red, white, and blue. It was unmistakably the same shield he had previously found painted on the wall, picked out in fine stitchwork instead of crude spray paint. The red of St. George's Cross gleamed against the pure white inlay, the symbols of the Cairo and the letters Alpha and Omega contrasted against cerulean blue quartering. The old church sign. It was a symbol from a different Britannia, a Britannia that existed before the emblem of blood. When Baudouin de Bretagne, 92nd Emperor of Britannia, has been assassinated in 1955, it kicked off a struggle for the throne that would not be fully resolved until that man brought the conflict to a shuddering stop in 1998. The Britannia that emerged from the calamitous 4-decade-long succession struggle was a very different creature from what it had once been. Virtually every source of legitimacy had been demolished over those long, bloody years, including the old Britannic Church. Long a handmaiden of the imperial family, as the various dynastic branches fought for the throne, the ecclesiastical hierarchy likewise ripped each other asunder. In the end, Bishop Warren of Tucson had backed the right horse in Charles Z. Britannia and had been elevated to the position of Archbishop of Rochester and Chief Primate of the Britannic Church. A match made in hell, if ever there was one. The religious reforms had been just as overarching as the temporal reforms. As that man ruthlessly re-centralized power and brought nobles who had grown used to their freedoms back to heel, Archbishop Warren had made crucial changes to church doctrine, including the open embrace of polygamy, long an informal practice but never officially sanctioned, and the enshrining of the emperor as the living voice of God in the temporal realm. There had been, of course, protesting voices and dissidents pushing back on the radical new doctrine. Those voices had been branded heretics and had been executed as the heretics they now were. Drowned, beheaded, staked, and burned, Archbishop Warren had been ruthless in rooting out any old believing clergy unwilling or unable to go underground. And now, Lelouch thought as he looked up at the aged banner that had, in all probability, once graced the wall of a parish church, the remnants hide among the settlers in the newly conquered areas in the Pacific, or in the jungles of Areas 6 and 7 amongst the Catholic insurgents. All the while preaching of the day when a true king shall come to reopen the emblem of blood and cast down the usurper. I can work with this. Drawing on old lessons from his childhood spent as a prince of a holy empire, and thus required to attend public devotions on the high holidays, Lelouch drew himself up straight and, defying the orthodoxy of his childhood, raised the first two fingers, one straight and one slightly bent, thumb folded just so, to his forehead, before brushing down over his lips and down to his heart. Then, oriented towards the banner, he bowed low from the waist and crossed himself on rising. A gentle sigh of collective relief drifted from the small crowd as he made the appropriate ritual genuflection. Hands relaxed around copies of the Book of Common Prayer, and the few whose hands had slipped out of sight as Lelouch came down the stairs released whatever they had secreted in their pockets. A man stepped out from the crowd. "Peace be with you," he said, greeting Lelouch with a smile and an outstretched hand. "And also with you," Lelouch replied, shaking the proffered hand before adding, "and upon all who gather here in congregation." "We're still waiting on Father Timothy," the man explained as he guided Lelouch towards the gathered knot of people, away from the stairs. "He usually takes his time. But, in the meantime, you can call me Brother Philip. What name do you choose to worship under, brother?" Assumed names to introduce distance, in case one or more are found, Lelouch assumed. Some of them were probably in the crowd upstairs, and one could have heard me introduce myself as Leland, so that is not an option if I want to appear to be a savvy fellow traveler. So, what should I use? Remembering the elder half-sibling who had challenged him to memorize the Bible, who had inadvertently given him the tools to find this meeting, Lelouch promptly replied, "Brother Alexander, if you please." "Good to meet you, Brother Alexander," Philip said, his flashing white teeth a sharp contrast against his dark skin. "You can share my book for the service if you'd like." "Thank you," Lelouch replied politely, "I'd appreciate that." He looked down at the rough cement floor. "Pardon me for asking, but..." He gestured towards the unyielding surface. "Are we kneeling on that?" "Not hardly," Philip chuckled. "There's a pile of old seat cushions in the back corner. Just make sure to put whatever you take back afterward." As Lelouch returned to Philip's side, an old cushion spilling foam from busted seams tucked under his arm, an old man hobbled his way down the last step of the stairs. Judging by the carefully cleaned and bleached Roman collar around his neck and the much-mended but fraying stole around his neck, Lelouch deduced that the old man was the awaited Father Timothy. Or as Havelock and Charles might call him, Old Tim. Lelouch smiled, shaking his head. A schismatic priest conducting a bar trivia night. Splendid, splendid. Although, he reflected as Father Timothy coughed wetly into his sleeve, time has clearly not been kind to this old priest. For all that he was old and infirm, Father Timothy's voice was still quite robust as he raised his hands in benediction. "Light and peace, in Jesus Christ our Lord," he declared. "Thanks be to God," the crowd replied as one, Lelouch mouthing the time-worn ritual response. "Bless the Lord who forgives all our sins," Father Timothy continued, before plunging fully into a rite that was apparently an order of worship for evening prayer, according to the title splashed across the page Philip had open in his dog-eared tome. Lelouch let the words pass over him, facing forwards and appropriately attentive as his eyes passed over the heretics in attendance. Almost half were female and all, to a man, were obviously poor. Of the 27 people in attendance, Not counting himself or the priest, 15 were grey with age and only 2 children were present. And yet, one thing all have in common is the yearning hope writ large across their faces. They are all hungry for hope, for meaning, for a reason to look forward to the next day. And that old, sick man at the front is giving them just such a reason, even though his presentation skills are non-existent and he stands 1 foot in the grave. There is so much potential here if I can tap into it. And now, Father Timothy continued, his voice rough and cracked, a reading from the book of Isaiah. How is the faithful city become a harlot? It was full of judgment, righteousness lodged in it, but now murderers. Thy silver is become dross, thy wine mixed with water, thy princes are rebellious, and companions of thieves, every one loveth gifts, and followeth after rewards, they judge not the fatherless, neither doth the cause of the widow come unto them. Therefore, saith the Lord of hosts, the mighty one of Israel, I will ease me of mine adversaries and avenge mine enemies. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God, Lelouch chorused with the rest of the audience as the sermon began. Brothers and sisters, I will keep this brief. Father Timothy paused with a weary smile. As the 18th year of this new Babylonian captivity comes to a close, the news is bleak at every corner. The usurper sits on his bloody throne and his confederates turn Mother Church into a prostitute, as they have for nigh on 2 decades now. Every day brings us rumors of renewed purges of the faithful, of new martyrs brought to the Ravenstone and bound to wheel or spike. And yet, brothers and sisters, I implore you to keep strong in your faith and to cling on to hope. Every day that passes with some new atrocity or blatant malfeasance from the princes of men weakens their foundation, though they know it not. Everywhere, nobles and wealthy men scheme and steal and exploit. I tell you, in doing so they salt their own fields, and future harvests will rot in their hands. Likewise, the liars who wear mitres and vestments gorge themselves as their parishioners starve. For all that our people were desperate for stability, desperate for room to breathe, they will not suffer depredations at the hands of their intended protectors forever. As the churches grow empty and tithes wither away, the whores who call themselves priests will grasp ever more greedily, and in doing so dig their own graves. But, Timothy paused and smiled out at his tiny flock. You know this already, brothers and sisters. You have heard it all before, and the knowledge that our enemies cannot stand forever is scarce comfort when your bellies are empty and our brothers in Christ writhe beneath the bone-shattering blows of the rod and squirm helplessly as their limbs are braided about the spokes of the wheel. I know. I understand. I shall not lie to you, brothers and sisters, I doubt that most of us gathered here shall see the promised land reborn, cleansed of the rot and inequity that so plague our beloved homeland. I certainly shall not. Death is in my bones, and I doubt I will be with you to celebrate Christmas. And yet, I tell you, there is hope yet. The true prince shall come, the one who shall sit on the throne and drown the traitors in their own blood. He shall come to us as was promised, shall renew the Holy Empire as the true kingdom of God on earth. I know not when he will come, brothers and sisters, but I am ironclad in my certainty that he already walks amongst us, that he sees our suffering and hears the cries of his people. The perversity that Charles the usurper has wrought upon us demands justice, demands retribution, and our God would not deny us an instrument of his will to balance the scales. And so I say to you, brothers and sisters, as the spring gives way to summer and new life buds and grows, have faith. Hold on, my people, for our heavenly Father will not long suffer a liar to sit in his chair and speak in his name. As surely as spring shall give way to autumn and autumn to winter, all that is man shall rot and decay, and our dross will be turned back to silver once more. Our reading goes on to promise the restoration of Zion, of our Pendragon. Brothers and sisters, truly I tell you, she will be redeemed with judgment. She will be converted with righteousness. All who have forsaken our Lord will be consumed. Liar king and corrupt cleric alike, both shall burn, and nobody shall be able to put out the spark. A wrenching cough ripped its way out of Father Timothy's mouth, interrupting his sermon. Lelouch took the opportunity to glance sideways at Brother Philip. The man's face was enraptured, his eyes aglow as he stared at Father Timothy. The word of God, Father Timothy forced out as another bout of coughing interrupted him, for the people of God. Glory to you, Lord Christ. The reply of the congregation was fervent, a new fire breathed into them in the promises Father Timothy had made. And nothing that old Tim said is necessarily untrue, Lelouch considered, turning the brief sermon over in his mind. The empire is unquestionably riding for a fall. It is most obvious here in Japan, where all of the symptoms of imperial rot run rampant, but Clovis is merely a symptom of a larger failing, a decay that stems from that man and him alone. He emerged victorious from the emblem of blood, but the empire as a whole certainly did not. For all that Britannia rules a third of the world, she sits upon a crumbling foundation that no amount of conquest can mend. Another man stepped up as Father Timothy was given a glass of water to drink, and the congregation duly recited the Nicene Creed and chanted a brief hymn on the theme of light. Finally, Father Timothy recovered enough to deliver the closing blessing, and the service drew to a close as the congregation chorused a final thanks be to God in reply. After thanking Philip for the use of his book, Lelouch made his way over to where Father Timothy rested, leaning against the wall beside the banner of the Anglican shield. "That was quite the sermon, Rector," Lelouch said politely. "It's been quite a while since I heard such a passionately full-throated lesson. Admittedly, that is because I have not attended a service since before Mother's passing. It is not as if the Britannic Church fully shuns fire and brimstone, after all." "Thank you, young man." Timothy smiled amiably up through his beard, but the cool intelligence in those rheumy eyes was not lost on Lelouch. "I don't think I've met you before, and yet, you clearly are familiar with the proper ways." "I am," Lelouch replied with a deft smile, "from another flock than yours, yet follow the same shepherd. Or, at least, I was from another flock. I relocated to Tokyo from the Hiroshima settlement a few months ago." "Ah, I see." The old man smiled, although the smile again didn't quite touch his wary eyes. "I rejoice that you found your way to us. Now, pardon an old man's curiosity, but your accent. I couldn't help but notice the traces of Pendragon." "My father hails from Pendragon," Lelouch replied honestly, "although my mother is from Area 2. I lived in Pendragon before orders came down that sent my family to Area 11. "Ah, that would be it," Timothy nodded. "Forgive an old man's curiosity. It's not as if Pendragon accents are exactly rare. Lots of us came from the homeland, after all, but just that combined with the touches of an aristocratic tone." "No worries," Lelouch said jovially. "My father is from a very minor noble family, but only barely, grandson of a third son, you see. He tried to squabble against the main branch for the family holdings back in the day, which played a role in how we ended up in Area 11. Lot of that going around," the old priest mused out loud. "Well then, my son, consider yourself welcome here." "Thank you, Rector," Lelouch replied politely, probing carefully for an edge to carry the conversation along. This is the man to impress. The congregation was practically eating out of his hands. If his health is as bad as he said it was, he is also vulnerable and without a successor. "Ah, no need for formalities," Timothy waved the title away. "I haven't been a rector since '98, when the diocese discharged me from my post for refusing to swear to the new rite." "And you have been out of communion with the state church since then?" Lelouch asked. "Have you been underground since then, Father?" "Of course." Timothy wheezed slightly as an embittered laugh slipped out. 18 years of sleeping rough and traveling quietly from place to place, of preaching in basements like the catacombs of old Rome. They chased me all the way from Bainbridge in Area 4 to Tokyo, my son. And I'm one of the lucky ones. Old Uncle Knapsack is very thorough, you know. Lelouch nodded, recognizing the fore slang for a secret policeman of any affiliation. Someone who could cram you into his sack and make you disappear into the night. All the way to Tokyo from Cuba? That must have been quite the change, in climate if nothing else. Lelouch paired the joking remark with a smile. Still, you must have run quite fast to have lasted so long underground. I suppose so, Timothy sighed, although, as you heard, my running days are done. I can barely get around the settlement these days, even with that nifty new train our fool of a governor built. These old bones just can't take the stairs or long walks like they used to, and my wind is completely shot. Well, if it would not be too forwards of me, Lelouch began, sensing an opportunity, can I offer my assistance? I have some education, courtesy of my father, on the intricacies of our faith, and I have youth and vigor as well. I understand that those are the primary qualifications to be a lay Eucharistic minister, and if I could assist you with your duties in that office, it would benefit the church in hiding here in Area 11. You make a good point, admitted Timothy, and I do need help. Unfortunately, Those with the time and energy here lack the education or the ability to move freely about the settlement and beyond, which I understand you have. This is not, you understand, the only congregation I tend to. There are others, hidden throughout the settlement and the countryside beyond. I had figured as much, Lelouch confessed, or at least hoped. It would have been quite saddening to have finally found my way back to the true faith, only to find that it had withered to 7 in all of the settlement. It's not quite that bad, but... Timothy shook his head. That's neither here nor there. I no longer have the luxury to turn down any assistance offered, and... while I have only just met you, Brother Alexander, I am certain you are no police plant nor a spy. When the numbers are running rampant over the countryside, I doubt they would waste such an intelligent young man on our dregs. If you are willing to take on Eucharistic minister duties, I would be happy to have you. Thank you for demonstrating your faith in me, Lelouch replied, extending a hand. I will see that you will not regret it. Tell me, when would be best for us to meet further? Would you be willing to take a day trip out to Chiba this weekend? Timothy asked, grasping Lelouch's hand with a dignified frailty. There is a small gathering of the faithful out on the Boso Peninsula. If you wouldn't mind, they are due for the Eucharist this Sunday, and I would appreciate the aid. We meet at a tobacconist's, near the sewage treatment plant in Hamanoko, south of the barracks in Chiba City. I would be honored, Father, Lelouch said, releasing the old man's hand. I will stand ready to help keep the fire alight until the time comes for Dross to turn back into silver once more. Then go in peace, my son, and I'll see you on Sunday. Millie was waiting impatiently for Lelouch back up in the almost empty main room of the tap house. There you are, she said with a smile, honeysuckle sweetness not quite covering the acerbic exasperation. I thought you'd left and stuck me with the bill, but the bartender said you'd already paid up. Then I thought you'd somehow tripped into the toilet and had been flushed down the pipes with all the other turds, but nope, no sign of you in the bathrooms. Where the heck did you go, Leland? Oh, you know, I just went to my father's house, Lelouch jokingly replied, momentarily relishing her immediate and obvious shock before continuing. Well, not really, but something like that. I went to see a man about some silver. Hopefully not 30 pieces of the stuff. Do not worry, I will tell you more back at home. You had better, Millie retorted playfully as she fell into step beside him, otherwise the engagement's off, Leland. I can't have a husband who keeps secrets from me. We are engaged now? He turned to look at her, brow raised. I am all but certain that, when I left to pay the tab, we were just out on a casual date. When did we get engaged? That's what you get for zoning out on the conversation all night, Lulu. As he and Millie made their way back to the academy, Lelouch found his mind drifting back to the congregation in that dirty brick basement. Unlike the crowd of workers in the neighborhood by the train station, these were desperate people already actively hunted by the authorities. They had very little left to lose at this point. Which means they have everything to gain. And unlike economics, religion is a guaranteed hot-button issue. I made mistakes last time, but this time will be different. I will let Nunnally and Sayoko know, for one. Lelouch involuntarily shuddered, remembering the scolding he had received from his darling little sister after the poster debacle. And depending on what she says, I might bring Millie in on it too. The plan went awry last time, but now, things will be different. Britannia will fall. A new world for Nunnally. The true Anglicans are waiting for a true prince to come? I can be that. This can work. It will work. It has to work.